Chaucer's Official Life by James Root Hulbert. Note: in making reference to books and manuscripts, I have attempted to use abbreviations which seem reasonably clear. Perhaps the least intelligible are C.R., which stands for Close Rolls, and L.R., which stands for Life Records of Chaucer, Chaucer SOC. Wherever possible, I have referred to prints rather than to original manuscripts because the printed calendars are much more accessible. In a work which has involved the copying of innumerable references, many of which are to documents in the Public Record Office not available to me as I revise my copy, it is too much to expect that there should be no inaccuracies. Therefore, if the reader discovers erroneous references, I must ask his leniency. For their courtesy and assistance in making books and documents accessible to me, I wish most heartily to thank J.A. Herbert, Esq. of the Manuscript Department, the British Museum, and Edward Salisbury, Esq., and Hubert Hall, Esq., of the Public Record Office. To my friend and colleague, Dr. Thomas A. Knott, of the University of Chicago, I am deeply indebted for his kindness in reading over parts of my manuscript and trying to make their style clearer and more readable. My greatest obligation, however, is to Professor John M. Manley, not only for encouragement and specific suggestions as to the handling of this subject, but for a training which has made possible whatever in my results may be considered of value. Introduction. The researches of Sir Harris Nicolas, Dr. Furnivall, Mr. Selby, and others have provided us with a considerable mass of detailed information regarding the life and career of Geoffrey Chaucer. Since the publication of Nicholas's biography of the poet prefixed to the Aldine edition of Chaucer's works in 1845, the old traditional biography of conjecture and inference, based often on mere probability, or the contents of works erroneously ascribed to Chaucer, has disappeared, and in its place has been developed an accurate biography based on facts. In the 65 years since Nicholas's time, however, a second tradition, connected in some way with fact, to be sure, has slowly grown up. Writers on Chaucer's life have not been content merely to state the facts revealed in the records, but, in their eagerness to get closer to Chaucer, have drawn many questionable inferences from those facts. Uncertain as to the exact significance of the various appointments which Chaucer held, his engagement in diplomatic missions and his annuities, biographers have thought it necessary to find an explanation for what they suppose to be remarkable favors, and have assumed, cautiously in the case of careful scholars but boldly in that of popular writers, that Chaucer owed every enhancement of his fortune to his great patron, John of Gaunt. In greater or less degree this conception appears in every biography since Nicholas. Professor Minto in his Encyclopaedia Britannica article, footnote, edition Scribner's 1878, volume 5, page 450, says with regard to the year 1386, "That was an unfortunate year for him. His patron, John of Gaunt, lost his ascendancy at court, and a commission which sat to inquire into the abuses of the preceding administration superseded Chaucer in his 2 controllerships. The return of Lancaster to power in 1389 again brightened his prospects. He was appointed clerk of the King's Works," etc. Similarly, Dr. Ward in his Life of Chaucer, after mentioning that Chaucer and John of Gaunt were of approximately the same age, writes, footnote, English Men of Letters. Harper's. 1879, page 66. Nothing could, accordingly, be more natural than that a more or less intimate relationship should have formed itself between them. This relation, there is reason to believe, afterwards ripened on Chaucer's part into one of distinct political partisanship. With regard to the loss of the controllerships, Dr. Ward writes, footnote, page 104. The new administration, i.e. that of Gloucester and his allies, had as usual demanded its victims, and among their number was Chaucer. The explanation usually given is that he fell as an adherent of John of Gaunt. Perhaps a safer way of putting the matter would be to say that John of Gaunt was no longer in England to protect him. A little further on occurs the suggestion that Chaucer may have been removed because of his previous official connection with Sir Nicholas Brember, who, besides being hated in the city, had been accused of seeking to compass the deaths of the Duke and of some of his adherents. Footnote. It is curious that Dr. Wall did not realize that Chaucer could not possibly have belonged to the parties of John of Gaunt and of Brember. Later, In connection with the discussion of Chaucer's probable attitude toward Wycliffe, Dr. Ward writes, footnote, page 134. Moreover, as has been seen, his long connection with John of Gaunt is a well-established fact, and it has thence been concluded that Chaucer fully shared the opinions and tendencies represented by his patron. Dr. Ward's treatment is cautious and careful compared to that of Professor Henry Morley in his English Writers. For example, the latter writes, footnote, volume 5, page 98. Lionel lived till 1368, but we shall find that in and after 1358 Chaucer's relations are with John of Gaunt, and the entries in the household of the Countess Elizabeth might imply no more than that Chaucer, page to John of Gaunt, was detached for service of the Countess upon her coming to London. A few pages further on, footnote, page 103, in the same volume occurs a paragraph on the life of John of Gaunt Glost, Chaucer's patron, with regard to the grants of a pitcher of wine daily and the 2 controllerships. Professor Morley writes, footnote, page 107. These successive gifts Chaucer owed to John of Gaunt, who, in this last period of his father's reign, took active part in the administration. And again, footnote, page 109. John of Gaunt had administered affairs of government. It was he, therefore, who had so freely used the power of the crown to bestow marks of favor upon Chaucer. Footnote, page 110. It was his patron the Duke, therefore, who, towards the end of 1376, joined Chaucer with Sir John Burleigh, in some secret service of which the nature is not known. Footnote, Studies in Chaucer, Volume 1, pages 81 to 82. Finally, after mentioning Chaucer's being discharged from his controllerships, Morley writes, footnote, page 243. During all this time Chaucer's patron John of Gaunt was away with an army in Portugal. Such absolute certainty and boldness of statement as Professor Morley's is scarcely found again in reputable writers on Chaucer. Professor Lounsbury in his Life of Chaucer implies rather cautiously that Chaucer lost his places in the customs because of John of Gaunt's absence from the country, and as the result of an investigation of the customs. Mr. Jusserand in his Literary History of England writes, footnote, Ing. Trans. 1894, page 312. For having remained faithful to his protectors, the king and John of Gaunt, Chaucer was looked upon with ill favor by the men then in power, of whom Gloucester was the head, lost his places and fell into want. F. J. Snell in his Age of Chaucer has similar statements, almost as bold as those of Professor Morley. Footnote, page 131. John of Gaunt was the poet's lifelong friend and patron. Footnote, page 149. Chaucer was now an established favorite of John of Gaunt, through whose influence apparently he was accorded this desirable post, i.e., the first controllership, most remarkable of all. Footnote, page 230. Outwardly, much depended on the ascendancy of John of Lancaster. If the Duke of Lancaster prospered, Chaucer prospered with him. When the Duke of Gloucester was uppermost, the poet's sky was overcast, and he had hard work to keep himself afloat. The last quotations which I shall give on this point are from Skeat's Life of Chaucer prefixed to the single-volume edition of the poet's works in the Oxford series. Footnote, page 13. As the Duke of Gloucester was ill-disposed towards his brother John, it is probable that we can thus account for the fact that, in December of this year, Chaucer was dismissed from both his offices, of Comptroller of Wool and Comptroller of Petty Customs, others being appointed in his place. This sudden and great loss reduced the poet from comparative wealth to poverty. He was compelled to raise money upon his pensions, which were assigned to John Scalby on May 1, 1388. On the same page, 1389. On May 3, Richard II suddenly took the government into his own hands. John of Gaunt returned to England soon afterwards, and effected an outward reconciliation between the king and the Duke of Gloucester. The Lancastrian party was now once more in power, and Chaucer was appointed clerk of the king's works, etc. Closely connected with the question of Chaucer's relations with John of Gaunt, and indeed fundamental to it, as the constant reference in the foregoing extracts to the grants which Chaucer held would indicate, is the problem of the significance of Chaucer's annuities, offices, and diplomatic missions. Extracts from 2 writers on Chaucer's life will show how this problem has been treated. Professor Hales in his D.N.B. article, footnote 1 volume 10, page 157, says of the first pension from the king. This pension, it will be noticed, is given for good service done. The pension is separate from his pay as a valetus and must refer to some different service. Similarly, Professor Lounsbury in his Studies in Chaucer writes, footnote 2 volume 1, page 61. It is from the statement in this document about services already rendered that the inference is drawn that during these years he had been in close connection with the court. In regard to the grant of the wardship of Edward Staplegate, he says, footnote 3 Edom, page 65. This was a common method of rewarding favorites of the crown. In the roll which contains this grant it is said to be conferred upon our beloved Esquire. By way of comment on the grant of a pitcher of wine daily, he writes, footnote 4 Edom, page 63. Though never graced with the title of Poet Laureate, Chaucer obtained at this same period what came to be one of the most distinguishing perquisites which attached itself to that office in later times. With regard to the offices, footnote 5 Edom, page 66. Chaucer was constantly employed in civil offices at home and in diplomatic missions abroad. In both cases it is very certain that the positions he filled were never in the nature of sinecures. As to the diplomatic missions, footnote 6 Edom, page 70. Their number and their variety, treating as they do of questions of peace and war, show the versatility of his talents as well as his wide knowledge of affairs. Nor can I avoid feeling that his appointment upon so many missions, some of them of a highly delicate and important nature, is presumptive evidence that he was not a young man at the time and must therefore have been born earlier than 1340. These appointments are proofs that can hardly be gainsaid of the value put upon his abilities and services. Then, as now, there must have been plenty of persons of ample leisure and lofty connections who, footnote I volume 10, page 157. Footnote 8 volume 1, page 61. Footnote Edom, page 65. Footnote Edom, page 63. Footnote Edom, page 66. Footnote Edom, page 70. Were both ready and anxious to be pressed into the service of the state. That these should have been passed by, and a man chosen instead not furnished with high birth and already furnished with other duties, is a fact which indicates, if it does not show convincingly, the confidence reposed in his capacity and judgment. With regard to the controllership, Professor Lounsbury writes, footnote, Studies in Chaucer, page 72. The oath which Chaucer took at his appointment was the usual oath. He was made controller of the port because he had earned the appointment by his services in various fields of activity, and because he was recognized as a man of business, fully qualified to discharge its duties. Footnote Edom, page 74. In 1385 he was granted a much greater favor than the right to have a deputy for the petty customs. On the 17th of February of that year he obtained the privilege of nominating a permanent deputy. It is possible that in the end it wrought him injury, so far as the retention of the post was concerned. A merely casual reading of such statements as those I have given above must make it clear that they attempt to interpret the facts which we have about Chaucer, without taking into consideration their setting and connections, conditions in the courts of Edward III and Richard II, and the history of the period. Footnote: note for example the statement on page 3 above that the Duke of Gloucester was ill-disposed towards his brother John. Surely it is time for an attempt to gain a basis of fact upon which we may judge the real significance of Chaucer's grants and his missions, and from which we may determine as far as possible his relations with John of Gaunt. In the following pages, then, I shall attempt first to discover the relative importance of Chaucer's place in the court, and the significance of his varied employments, and secondly to find out the certain connections between Chaucer and John of Gaunt. The means which I shall employ is that of a study of the lives of Chaucer's associates, his fellow esquires, and justices of the peace, and his friends, and a comparison of their careers with that of Chaucer to determine whether or not the grants he received indicate special favor or patronage, and whether it is necessary to assume the patronage of John of Gaunt in particular to explain any step in his career. The esquires of the king's household, their families. We have the names of the esquires of the king's household in two lists of 1368 and 1369, printed in the Chaucer Life Records, footnote See page 13 ff. In the study of the careers of these esquires, the most difficult problem is to determine the families from which they were derived. Had they come from great families, of course, it would not have been hard to trace their pedigrees. But a long search through county histories and books of genealogy has revealed the families of only a few, and those few in every case come from an unimportant line. It is clear then that they never were representatives of highly important families. A statement of the antecedents of such esquires as I have been able to trace, the names arranged in alphabetical order, follows. John Beauchamp was almost certainly either that John Beauchamp of Holt who was executed in 1386, or his son. In either case he was descended from a younger branch of the Beauchamps of Warwick. Footnote: Issues, page 232, mem. 26, Peerage of England, Scotland, etc. by G. E. C. Volume 1, page 278. Patrick Byker, who was King's Artilleer in the Tower of London, footnote, 1,362 calories, c. R. page 373, was the son of John de Byker who had held the same office before him. Footnote, 35 EDW. 3, page 174 Cal Rot. Pat. Inter. Lon William Byker, probably a relative, is mentioned from about 1370 on as holding that office. Footnote, Devon's Issues, 1370, page 33 Issues, page 303 mem. 14. I have been able to learn nothing further about the family. Nicholas Carré. In the records one finds reference to Nicholas Carré the Elder and Nicholas Carré the Younger. Footnote, Ancient Deeds 10681. Since the elder was guardian of the Privy Seal from 1372 to 1377, footnote, Reimer, page 951, 1069, and in 1377 was one of the executors of the will of Edward III, it seems likely that the esquire was Nicholas Carré the Younger. At any rate the younger was the son of the older, footnote, c. R. 229 mem. 33 Dorso, 12 Rich. 2. And they were certainly members of the family of Carré in Surrey, footnote, 1,378 calories, Pat. Roll, page 143, 1,381 to 5 calories, Pat. Roll Passum, Cal Inquiry P. M. 3 125. The pedigrees of this family do not show Nicholas the Younger, so far as I have found. But a Nicholas, Baron Carew, who may have been the keeper of the Privy Seal, does occur. Footnote, Visitation of Surrey Harleian SOC page 17. The name of his son, as given in the pedigree, is not Nicholas. Consequently Nicholas, the Younger, was probably not his eldest son. This last supposition is supported by certain statements in Westcott's Devonshire. Footnote, page 528. Of course it is not certain that this Sir Nicholas was the keeper of the Privy Seal, where we are told that Sir Nicholas Carew, Baron of Carew Castle, Montgomery in Wales, married the daughter of Sir Hugh Conway of Hacombe, and had issue Thomas, Nicholas, Hugh, etc. Roger Cleberry. In Westcott's Devonshire, footnote, page 555, occurs an account of a family named Cloberry, of Bradston. In the course of his statement, which is devoid of dates or mention of lands other than Bradston, Westcott refers to 2 Rogers. Several men of the name of William de Clopton are mentioned in the county histories. Unfortunately no facts appear in the records to connect any one of them with the esquire of that name. At any rate from the accounts given in Gage, footnote, Gage's History of Suffolk, Thingo 100, page 419, and Morant, footnote, Morant's Essex, volume 2, page 321, the following pedigree is clear. Thomas de Clopton Sir William de Clopton, 20 EDW. 3 Sir William, Edmund, John, Walter, Thomas William. The elder Sir William, according to Gage, married first Annette, daughter of Sir Thomas de Grey, and secondly Mary, daughter of Sir William Cockerell. With his second wife he received the manor and advowson of Hawstead and lands in Hawstead, Newton, Great and Little Horningshire and Bury St. Edmunds. Morant speaks of the family as an ancient one and traces it back to the time of Henry I. Robert de Corbie was son of Robert and Joan de Corbie, footnote, Pat. Roll 291 mem. 1. His father had been yeoman in the king's court and had received a number of grants from the king. Footnote: Kelsey. R. Page 496, 1345. Calrot. Pat. Tur. Lon. 38 EDW. 3 p. 1 foot 78 inches b. Collard, or Nicholas d'Abrichecourt, was a son of Nicholas d'Abrichecourt, brother of Sir Eustace d'Abrichecourt of Warwickshire. Footnote: Visit of War, Harl. Page 47, Belts Mem. Of Garter, page 90. The latter had won the favor of Philippa in France, and had come to England when she was married to Edward III. George Felbrigg was, according to Blomfield's Norfolk, footnote, volume 8, page 107 ff., descended from a younger branch of the Bigods. The head of this family was the Earl of Norfolk. Sir Simon, third son of Hugh, Earl of Norfolk, Sir Roger, plus Sir Simon John le Bigod, Sir Roger le Bigod, Sir Simon, Sir George. The younger branch of the family had assumed the name of Felbrigg from a town of that name in Norfolk. As will be seen, George Felbrigg came from the younger branch of the family, and his ancestors seem to have been neither influential nor wealthy. Robert de Ferrers' pedigree was as follows. Footnote: Baker's Northampton, Volume 1, p. 123. John Ferrers equals Hawise D. of Sir Robert Macigros. Baron Ferrers Robert, 2nd Baron equals Agnes A. D. of Humphrey Bohun, Earl of Hereford, plus John, 3rd Baron Robert Obit. April 2, 1367, died 1381. Since his brother died only a year before the date of the first of the lists, it is very likely that Robert became a member of the king's household, while still a younger son. His father, Robert, 2nd Baron Ferrers, was one of the knights of the king's chamber. He fought in the campaigns in France and Flanders. Thomas Frowick was probably a member of a prominent London family of merchants. License rights of the family as follows. Footnote: Parishes in Middlesex, etc., page 228. The manor of Oldfold was at a very early period the property of the Frowicks or Frowicks. Henry Frowick, who was settled at London in 1329, was sixth in descent from Thomas Frowick of the Oldfold, the first person mentioned in the pedigree of the family. Thomas Frowick, a younger brother of Henry above mentioned, inherited the Oldfold estate, which continued in the family till his grandson's time. This Thomas Frowick is mentioned in the close rolls between 1351 and 1353 as Justice of the Peace for Middlesex, and in footnote 1, Ancient Deeds a 9086. 27 Edward III as Lieutenant of the Queen's Steward. The connections of Thomas Hawking are not quite so clear, but apparently he likewise was derived from a family of London merchants. Blomfield's Norfolk, footnote 2, volume 10, page 426 ff., tells of a family of Hawtings of knightly rank. Sir John Hawking probably became a citizen of London in 16 Edward II and was subsequently receiver of the King's Customs of Wool at London. Even earlier than this, in 15 Edward I, a Walter Hawking was Sheriff of London, footnote 3, Ancient Deeds a 1625. In 7 Edward III a John Hawking was Alderman of a ward in London, footnote 4, Edom, a 1472. We can suppose some connection between Thomas Hawking and this family because he held certain tenements in London, footnote 5, Edom, a 7833. John de Hurling, who was usher of the King's Chamber and the most important of the esquires in Chaucer's time, came of a family settled in Norfolk. Blomfield gives a pedigree of the family beginning with this John de Hurling, footnote 6, volume 1, page 319, but is unable to trace his ancestry definitely. He finds mention of a certain Odo de Hurling, but is forced to the conclusion that the family was an unimportant one before the time of John de Hurling. With regard to Ralph de Knifton, very little information is forthcoming. Glover's Derby, footnote 7, volume 2, page 135, 6, gives the pedigree of a family of Knightons who possessed the manor of Bradley and says that there was a younger branch of the family which lived at Mercaston. Ralph, though not specifically mentioned, may have been a younger son of one of these branches. Although Helming Legett was an important man in his own time, Sheriff of Essex and Hertfordshire in 1401 and 1408, footnote 8, Morant's Essex, volume 2, page 123, and Justice of the Peace in Suffolk, footnote 9, cf. Cal. Pat. Roll. 1381-5, page 254. Morant is able to give no information about his family. Perhaps his position in the society of the county was due in part to the fact that he married an heiress, Alice, daughter of Sir Thomas Mandeville. Footnote 10, cf. Cal Pat. Roll. 1381-5, page 254. John Legge, who is on the list as an esquire, but in the patent rolls is referred to chiefly as a sergeant-at-arms, was, according to H. T. Riley, son of Thomas Legge, mayor of London in 1347 and 1354. Footnote 11, Memorials, page 450. Robert Louth was evidently derived from a Hertfordshire family. A Robert de Louth was custodian of the Castle of Hertford and supervisor of the city of Hertford in 32 Edward III. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur. Lawn, page 169b, and between 1381 and 1385 was Justice of the Peace for Hertford. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll Index. Probably Robert de Louth was a younger son, for John, son and heir of Sir Roger de Luthe, in 44 Edward III, deeded land in Hertfordshire to Robert de Luthe, Esquire, his uncle. Footnote: Ancient Deeds, D 4213. John de Romsey comes of an eminent Southampton family of the town of Romsey. Footnote: Woodward, Wilkes, Lockhart, History of Nottinghamshire. Volume 1, page 352, which can be traced back as far as 1228, when Walter of Romsey was Sheriff of Hampshire. His pedigree is given as follows by Hoare. Footnote: History of Wilts, Volume 3, 100 of Odin, page 23. Walter de Romsey 34 Edward I. Walter de Romsey 23 Edward III equals Joan. John de Romsey equals Margaret D. and Company Somerset heir of. Hugh Strelly was a member of the family of Strelly, Strahl, of Nottingham and Derby. From the fact that his name does not occur in the pedigree given in Thornton's History of Nottinghamshire, footnote, Volume 2, page 220, and that he held lands of Nicholas de Strelly by the fourth part of a knight's fee, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll, 1892, page 56. It is clear that he belonged to a subordinate branch of the family. Further, he was even a younger son of this secondary stock, for, as brother and heir of Philip de Strelly, son and heir of William de Strelly, he inherited lands in 47 Edward III. Footnote: C. R. 211 mem. 38. Gilbert Talbot was second, son of Sir John Talbot of Richard's Castle in Herefordshire. Footnote: Cf. Nicholas, Scrope Grosvenor Roll, Volume 2, page 397. Hugh Wake may be the Hugh Wake who married Joan de Wolverton and whom Lipscomb connects with the lordly family of Wake of Buckinghamshire. Footnote: Lipscomb's Buckinghamshire, Volume 4, page 126. He is quite wrong as to the date of this Hugo's death. Cf. Close Rolls, 1861, pages 228-9, which show that Hugh was living at this date. These 18 or 19 esquires, then, are the only ones in the long list whose family connections I have been able to trace. Certain others, as for example the various Shanes, Hugh, Roger, Thomas, John and William, Robert La Soche, Simon de Burgh and Geoffrey Stuckle, may have been derived from noble families of their name. In that case, however, they were certainly not in the direct line of descent, for their names do not appear in the pedigree of those families. On the other hand, many of the names would seem to indicate that their possessors came from obscure families. In several cases, for example, esquires practically gave up their own names and were called by occupational names. So the Richard de Arms of the records was probably Richard de Careswell Vadlet del Arms. Footnote: Exchequer K. R. Accounts 392-15, who had charge of the king's personal armor. Reynold Barber is once called Reynold le Barber. Footnote: Issues page 220, 32 EDW. 3. Roger Farrow was one of the king's shoesmiths. Footnote: 1,378 calories. Pat. Roll, page 158, and his personal name was Roger Bonington. Footnote: Rich. 2. Calpat. Roll, page 597. Robert Larderer is never mentioned in the records, but Robert Magfeld, called King's Larderer, is mentioned. Footnote: Issues page 222 mem. 21. Devon's Issues 1370, page 22, page 34. Richard Waffer occurs on the records, although the name occurs 3 times in the household lists, but Richard Markham, Waffer, occurs frequently. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 179. Richard Leche, called King's Surgeon, footnote, EDW. 3, issues page 230 mem. Unnumbered, was probably identical with Richard Erland, King's Surgeon. Footnote: Devon's Issues 1370, pages 103-333. John Leche also was King's Surgeon, but I have found mention of him under no other name. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 178, 1383, page 283. Robert Viner was vinekeeper or gardener to Edward III. Footnote: Devon's Issues 1370, page 115. Certain of the other names, though apparently family names, seem to be of occupational or place origin, e.g. Thomas Spignall, Simon de Buchanum, John de Beverley, Henricus Almania, Cornelius de Bernia, William de York, etc. Finally, some names by their very character could scarcely be the names of noble families, e.g. Walter Whittor, Walter Chippenham, John Catt, etc. From what I have been able to find out about the families of some of these men, from the character of the names, and from the fact that the families of the great bulk of the esquires cannot be traced, it is clear that the esquires of the king's household were chiefly recruited either from the younger sons of knightly families, or from quite undistinguished stock. In 3 cases, those of John Legge, Thomas Hawtine, and Thomas Frowick, it seems probable that they came, as Chaucer did, from merchants' families in London. Appointment. We can scarcely expect any outright statement of the reasons in general, or in particular for the appointment of esquires. Nevertheless, I find 2 circumstances which may indicate the conditions of appointment. First, some previous connection of their fathers with the king's court, and second, some previous connection on their own part with the household of one of the king's children. Of those whose fathers or relatives had been in the court may be mentioned John Beauchamp, footnote, cf. page 6, supra. Patrick Biker, footnote, page 6. Nicholas Carre, footnote, page 6. Robert Corby, footnote, page 7. Collard d'Abrio Hecourt, footnote, page 7. Robert de Ferrers, footnote, page 8. And William Burrell, footnote, Gal. Pat. Roll, 1378, page 283. Who was son of the Sir John de Burghley with whom Chaucer was associated on one mission. Of course, John Legge's father, as Mayor of London, must have been known at court, and one of Thomas Hawtine's progenitors had been receiver of King's Customs at London. Footnote of page 9 supra. Even more interesting is the case of those esquires who before entering the king's service had been in the household of one of his children, i.e. Edward the Black Prince, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, or his wife, John of Gaunt, Isabella, wife of Injoram de Coucy, and Edmund, Count of Cambridge. Roger Archer, Griffith de la Chamber, Henry de Almaine, and Richard Tourpearl seem to have been in the service of Isabella, the king's daughter, for, in the grants of annuities which they received, special mention is made of their service to her. Footnote: Issues page 241 mem. LL page 239 mem. 15. Page 301 mem. Possibly they were always in her service. Stephen Romelow is expressly called Esquire of Edward Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, and he held an annuity from that prince. Footnote: Pat. Roll 272 mem. 22, 285 mem. 25. 10 calories, Pat. Roll 1378, page 197, 1385, page 26. Richard Worrell signed an indenture to serve John of Gaunt as an esquire in 46 Edward III, after the date at which he is mentioned in the household books. Footnote: Duchy of Lancaster Registers No. 13, f. 125 Dorso. Since he seems never to have received an annuity from the king, or a grant, except in one instance for his wages in the wars, it seems likely that he was never actually in the king's service, but rather in that of John of Gaunt. Robert Urswick was connected in some way with John of Gaunt and also with Edmund, Count of Cambridge, son of Edward III. Footnote: Edom F. 94, Pat. Roll 274, MEM. 29. Roger Mareschal, John Jose and Robert Bardolph held annuities of £20 each per annum from Lionel Duke of Clarence, footnote, Cal Pat. Both 1383, page 326, and so were probably at one time in his service. Finally, the most interesting case of all is that of Geoffrey Stuckle, whose career and employments curiously parallel Chaucer's and who in 29 Edward III was valet to Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster. Footnote, Issues, page 212, MEM, 22, 27. Classification. The two lists in the household books classify the members of the household in different ways, one list according to function and the other, apparently, according to length of service. The first is the system according to which the schedule of names conjecturally dated December 1368, footnote, printed as number 53 of the Chaucer records, page 162, was made, and the latter is the system governing the list of September 1, 1369, number 58 Chaucer records, page 172. A glance at the second of these in comparison with the first will show how it was made up. It classifies the esquires in two groups: esquires de grandeur estat and esquires de maindre degree. Looking at the names of the esquires de grandeur estat, we notice that the first 13 are names which appear in the group of esquires of 1368, that the next 10 are identical, even in the order of occurrence, with the list of sergeants d'armes of 1368, that the following 7 are the first 7 in the list of sergeants d'offices parvents furs a chaperon of 1368, in the same order, that then Andrew Tyndall, who in 1368 was an esquire ma dame, appears, and is followed by the rest of the sergeants d'offices parvents furs, etc., in the same order as in 1368, that the next 6 were in 1368 esquires ma dame, and that finally occur 10 names not found in the lists of 1368. From this comparison it is clear that the list of 1369 was made up from a series of lists of different departments in the king's household. The list of esquires de maindre degree of 1369 was doubtless made in the same way, although the evidence is not so conclusive. The first 22 names correspond to names in the list of esquires of 1368. The next 11 occur in the list of esquires servants of 1368. The following 5 appear among the esquires ma dame of 1368. The next 13 do not occur in the lists of 1368, but the following 8 correspond even in order to the list of esquires falconers of 1368. It is therefore clear that we have here a cross division. That the list of 1368 gives a division according to function is clear from the titles of all groups except one. The esquires classified as falconers, servants ma dame, etc., performed the function suggested by those titles, a fact which can be demonstrated by many references to the function of these men in other documents. In the case of the one exception, the sergeants d'offices parvents furs a chaperon, it is clear that they performed duties similar to those of the esquires servants. For example, Richard d'Armes was valet of the King's Arms, footnote, Exchequer K. R. Accounts 392, 12, f. 36 Dorso. Edom. Number 15. William Blackamoor was one of the king's buyers, subordinate to the purveyor of fresh and salt fish, footnote, C. R. 1359 page 545. John de Koningsby was likewise a buyer of victuals for the household, footnote, Pet. Roll 276, MEM. 4. John Goderic and John Gosdine were cooks in the household, footnote, Pat. Roll 1378, page 212, Devon's Issues, 1370, page 311. Richard Leche was king's surgeon, footnote, Edom. Page 230 MEM. Not numbered. Thomas Disdains was sub-purveyor of the poultry, footnote, C. R. 1359, page 545. William Street was the king's butler, footnote, Issues, page 228, MEM. 38. Edmund de Tetsworth was the king's baker, footnote, Pat. Roll, 1378, page 224. etc. Hence it is clear that all these performed duties which in the main were of a menial character. On the other hand, the division into two groups in the list of 1369 seems to indicate not the function of the esquires, but their rank in the household. Their rank, in turn, appears to be determined by various considerations. Function: all the falconers of 1368 are enrolled among the esquires of less degree in 1369. Length of service, and to some extent considerations which are not manifest. That length of service played some part in the division seems clear from a study and comparison of the careers of the various men. Since we are interested in knowing particularly the significance of the classification of Chaucer, who appeared in 1368 as an esquire, I shall confine myself to a consideration of the esquires of that year. The names of the esquires of greater degree with the date at which they are first mentioned in connection with the household, in documents outside the household books, follow. Johann Herling. 18 Edward III, 1344, footnote, abbreviation Rot. Originally, Volume 2, page 65, Waterwittor. 1343, footnote C. R. page 203, Johann de Beverley. 36 Edward III, 1362, footnote, Pat. Roll 265, MEM. 17, Johann Romsey. 35 Edward III, 1361, footnote, Pat. Roll 264, MEM. 24, Water Walsh. 36 Edward III. 1362, footnote, Edom 266, Men. 47, Roger Cleberry. 1349, footnote, Edom, page 227, Helming Legate. 33 Edward III. 1359, footnote, Issues, page 223 MEM. 32, Ralph de Niveton. 35 Edward III. 1361, footnote, Pat. Roll 264 MEM. 18, Richard Torporel. 38 Edward III. 1364, footnote, Edom 272 MEM. 22, Johann Northrug. 37 Edward III. 1363, footnote, Issues, page 232, MEM. 5, Hanan Narrat. 38 Edward III. 1364, footnote, Issues, page 237, MEM. 17, Simon de Bokenham. 37 Edward III. 1363, footnote, Pat. Roll 267, MEM. 7, Johann Legge. 36 Edward III. 1362, footnote, Edom 266, MEM. 3. The Esquires de Maindre degree. Follow. He Wake. 1353, footnote, Edom, page 380, Piers de Cornwall. 37 Edward III. 1363, footnote, Edom 268, MEM. 18, Robert Ferrers. 1370, footnote, Reimer 3, 902, Robert Corby. 43 Edward III. 1369, footnote, C. R. MEM. 23 Dorso. The last two are difficult to distinguish from their fathers of the same name who had been in the King's Court before their time, Collard Dawbridge Court. 44 Edward III. 1370, footnote, Pat. Roll 281 MEM. 18, Thomas Hawtine. 41 Edward III. 1367, footnote, Edom 1399, page 65, Issues, page 250, MEM. 2, Hugh Shane. 32 Edward III. 1358, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 248, Thomas Vauxhall. Footnote, I cannot identify him surely. A Thomas de Vauxhall was in the King's Court in 4 EDW. 3FF, abbreviation Rot. Originally 2, page 39. He was growing old in 1352, Cal Pat. Roll, page 270, and died 30 EDW. 3 Cal Inquiry P. M. 220, leaving his property to a son and heir John. Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Styuical. 31 Edward III. 1356, footnote, issues, page 217, MEM. 114, in 29 EDW. 3 in service of Countess of Ulster, Simon de Burgh. 44 Edward III. 1370, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 189, Johann de Tykemmersch. No mention outside of household books, where he appears for first time in 1368. Robert La Zush. 29 Edward III. 1355, footnote, issues, page 213, MEM. 24, Esmond Rose. 17 Edward III. 1343, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1348, page 39, Lawrence Hawberk. 1370, footnote, issues 1370, Devon, pages 136 for 44, Griffith Dell Chamber. 28 Edward III. 1354, footnote, issues, page 294, MEM. 18, Johann de Thorpe. 30 Edward III. 1356, footnote, Edom, page 214, MEM. 8, Thomas Hertfordingbury. 41 Edward III. 1367, footnote, Pat. Roll 275, MEM. 13, Hugh Strahl. No certain mention as valet or esquire. Hugh Lingen. 37 Edward III. 1363, footnote, Edom 267, MEM. 37 Nicholas Priage. 33 Edward III. 1359, footnote, Exchequer K. R. Accounts, Bundle 392, Number 15, Richard Whirl. No record as valet or esquire of the king. A comparison of the two sections shows that the first contains the names of 2 men whose service goes back as far as 1343, 1344, and that it contains the name of no one who was not by 1364 associated with the court. The second section, on the other hand, contains but one name of a date earlier than 1353 and several which do not occur in the records before the time of this document, or in fact until a year or 2 later. The fact, however, that in a number of cases the second section contains names of men who entered the household years before others whose names occur in the first section makes it seem probable that special circumstances might influence the classification of a given esquire. Linked with this problem of classification is one of nomenclature, the use of the terms valetus and esquire, or the Latin equivalents of the latter, armiger and scudifer. Chaucer scholars have generally assumed that the term esquire represents a rank higher than valetus, but they give no evidence in support of this distinction, and we are interested in knowing whether it is correct or not. A first glance at the list of 1369, to be sure, and the observation that cooks and falconers, a shoesmith, footnote, Pat. Roll 1378, page 158, and a larderer, footnote, issues, Devon, 1370, page 45, are called esquires there, might lead one to think that the word can have but a vague force and no real difference in meaning from valetus. But an examination of other documents shows that the use of the term esquire in the household lists does not represent the customary usage of the time. It is to be noted, for example, that many of the esquires of 1369, practically all of the esquires de offices, footnote, for indication of their functions see page 14, etc., and the esquires servants of 1368 are not called esquires in the list of 1368, the patent rolls, close rolls, issue rolls, or fine rolls. William de Riceby and Thomas Spiggernell are the only clear exceptions to this rule. Of the esquires servants, I have noted 18 references with mention of title, and 17 of which the man named is called valetus, or serviens. Of the sergeants de offices, Richard de Arms is called valetus, or serviens, in 12 different entries, never esquire. Footnote Pat. Roll 265, MEM. 21, 279, MEM. 5, 273 MEM. 15, 355, MEM. 8 issues, page 207, MEM. 4, page 217, MEM. 29, etc. I have noted 35 other references to men in the same classification with the title Valetus. Footnote Pat. Roll 276, MEM. 4 issues, page 237, Pat. Roll 265, MEM. 14, 266, MEM. 9, Needham, MEM. 47, etc. It is clear then that although the usage is not strict, these men were really of the rank of Valetus, and that this rank was lower than that of Esquire. Possibly the household books used the term Esquire in this loose way out of courtesy, but the other documents, which were strictly official, for the most part used it more exactly in accordance with the man's actual rank. From a study of the records of the Esquires of 1368, the group to which in that year Chaucer belonged, we learn further conditions under which the terms Valetus and Armiger or Scutifer are used. In nearly all cases, these esquires in the early years of their career are called Valetus. After some years of service, they are occasionally called Armiger, and finally, after the passage of more years, are always called Armiger or Scutifer. Demonstration of this fact would take pages of mere references, but it can be indicated in a typical case, that of Geoffrey Stuckle, chosen because of the fact that his classification is throughout the same as Chaucer's. In 31, 33, and 35 Edward III he is called Valetus. In 36 Edward III, he appears once as Scutifer, and twice as Valetus. In 37 Edward III he is once named Valetus. In 38 Edward III he is called once Scutifer, and another time Valetus. In 41 Edward III he is mentioned twice as Valetus. In 42 and 43 Edward III he is Armiger. In 47 Edward III he is once Valetus, and once Armiger. In 49 Edward III he is called Armiger, twice. In 50 Edward III, and 1 and 2 Richard II he is called Armiger. Footnote Pat. Roll 269 MEM. 43, 273 MEM. 35, 265 MEM. 1, 275 MEM. 24, 293 MEM. 19, 267 MEM. 21, issues page 223 MEM. 17, 222 MEM. 20, a 169 MEM. 130, page 229 MEM. 22 MEM. 25, twice, page 217 MEM. 14, 18, page 235 MEM. 1, 248 MEM. Not numbered, 249 MEM. 4, 264 MEM. Not numbered, 262 MEM. 9, 271 MEM. 17, 273 MEM. 20, 295 MEM. 11. From this and the other cases in the list of esquires, it is clear that the term esquire, the equivalent of Scutifer and Armiger, indicates a rank above that of Valetus. The members of Chaucer's group, in nearly every case, were at first entitled Valeti, and then in course of time became esquires. Whatever may be the conclusion with regard to the meaning of those titles, however, it is clear, from the facts cited above, that the list of esquires of 1368 and not that of the esquires de maindre degree of 1369 gives the names of the men who were actually in the same class as Chaucer. Consequently, in the consideration of the esquires which follows, greater attention will be paid to the esquires of 1368 than to the other classes. Services. With regard to the services which the household books prescribe for the esquires, I shall say nothing. In the public records, however, I have found special services to which the individual esquires were assigned. In the first place, certain of these men, even those who appear in the list of 1368 as esquires, and in that of 1369 as esquires de grandre estat, or esquires de maindre degree, performed special functions of a character which makes it seem unlikely that they ever did the service which the household books required of an esquire of the king's household. In the list of 1368, for example, Esmond Rose was custodian of the great horses of the king, footnote, issues, page 216, mem. 18. Hugh Lingen was a buyer of the household, footnote, Pat. Roll 1384, page 435. Nicholas Priage was first king's minstrel, and later sergeant at arms, footnote, issues, page 228, mem. 24, 36 EDW. 3, page 273 mem. 11, 50 EDW. 3. Simon de Bokenham was chief sergeant of the larder, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 165, and John Led was sergeant at arms, footnote, Reimer 3, 2891. Secondly, certain of the esquires held special offices in the king's chamber. John Herling and Walter Walsh were ushers of the king's chamber, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 133, Edom page 150. John de Beauchamp was keeper of the king's jewels or receiver of the king's chamber for some years up to 11 Richard II, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1384, page 488. Then for a short time he was seneschal, steward, of the king's household, footnote, issues, page 316, mem. 2. Thomas Shane was in 43 Edward III keeper of the keys of the coffers of the king's jewels, footnote, Pat. Roll 279 mem. 33. John de Salisbury was at different times called usher of the king's chamber, and keeper of the king's jewels, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1385, page 15, Cal Pat. Roll 1381 to 5 Passam. Helming Legett was from 1362 for many years receiver of the king's chamber, his business being to keep the king's money, receive it from various people and pay it out, footnote, Reimer, volume 3, page 911. Thirdly, esquires were frequently being sent about England on the king's business. For example, in 1385 Simon de Buckingham was appointed buyer of horses for the king's expedition into Scotland, footnote, Cal Pat. Roll, page 579. In 1370 Lawrence Hawberk was sent to Berwick upon Tweed and from there by sea coast to retain shipping for the passage of Robert Knowles to Normandy, footnote, Devon's Issues, page 136. Similarly at other times Helming Legett and John Romsey, John de Salisbury and Thomas Spiggernell were detailed to take ships for royal expeditions, footnote, issues, page 270, mem. Not numbered, page 262, mem. 13, page 298, mem. 23. Reimer, volume 3, page 90. Again, Walter Whitgore in 1370 was sent to York to borrow money from divers abbots, priors, and others for the king's use, footnote, Devon's Issues, page 111. In 1370 John de Beauchamp was sent to the abbot of Gloucester to borrow money for the king's use, footnote, Edom, page 153, issues, page 308, mem. And in 7 Richard II Walter Chippenham was assigned to raise money for the king's use out of the lands of the late Edmund Mortimer, Count of March, footnote. Similarly Geoffrey Stuckle, page 298, mem. 23. In 5 Richard II Simon de Burgh was appointed to inquire into the possessions held by the rebels who had lately risen against the king in Cambridge, footnote, Edom, page 305, mem. 3. In 47 Edward III, Nicholas d'Ambridge Court was appointed to convey the children of Charles of Blois from the custody of Roger Beauchamp to that of Robert de Morton, footnote, Edom, page 262, mem. 14. Of less importance but equal frequency are the employments of esquires to convey money from the king's treasury or from some customs house to the king's wardrobe. John de Beauchamp de Holt Lafitz, Hugh Shane, Ralph de Niveton, Walter Chippenham, and Robert Lazush were at various times so employed. Footnote, issues, page 229, mem. 24, page 217, mem. 22 Devon, page 156, page 281, mem. 2, page 213, mem. 24, page 229, mem. 19. Of course, during the King's Wars, many of the esquires served in the army abroad. In the issues of the Exchequer for 1370, for example, many entries of this type appear. John de Beverley, L. 10715s. 5d. due in the wardrobe for the expenses of himself, his men-at-arms and archers in the war. Devon, page 483. Hugh Shane, Edom, page 449, Robert de Corbie, Edom, page 461. Collard Dabridgecourt, page 461. Helming Leggett, Edom, page 447. John Legge, Edom, page 449. Thomas Spiggernell, page 490, etc. Most interesting with relation to Chaucer, however, is the employment of esquires on missions abroad. Apparently certain individuals were assigned especially to this kind of business, and many of these were kept almost constantly engaged in it. For example, George Felbrigg, in 51 Edward III, was sent on the king's secret business to John Duke of Brittany in Flanders. Footnote: Issues, page 274, mem. 11. In 2 Richard he was sent with John Burrell and others on king's secret business to Milan. Footnote: Edom, page 298, mem. 20. In 4 Richard II he was sent to the king of the Romans and of Bohemia on secret business touching the king's marriage. Footnote: Edom, page 303, mem. 2. In 5 Richard II he was sent again to Flanders. Footnote: Edom, page 305, mem. 13. In 11 Richard II, being then knight of the king's chamber, he was sent to Middelburg to receive the homage of the Duke of Gueldres. Footnote: Edom, page 316, mem. 2. And again in 14 Richard II he was sent on the king's business to the king of the Romans and of Bohemia. Footnote: Edom, page 323, mem. 5. That the service was not a special honor but merely a business function of the esquire is clear from the fact that Felbrigg was on one occasion called King's Messenger beyond seas. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1384, page 367. Similarly, Geoffrey Stuckle, whose career, I have already pointed out, closely parallels Chaucer's, made many voyages abroad in the king's business between 33 Edward III and 2 Richard II. In 33 Edward III, and again in 35 Edward III, he was sent to Normandy on the king's business. Footnote: Issues, page 223, mem. 17, a 169, mem. 30, mem. 38. On many of his missions he merely carried letters to John of Gaunt, in Devon's Issues 1370, for example. 5 such missions in a single year are mentioned, or to various nobles directing them to arm themselves for an expedition under John of Gaunt. Footnote: Edom, page 262, mem. 9. Likewise Stephen Romulo was employed on many missions from 25 Edward III on. Footnote: Edom 25 EDW. 3p, mem. 21, 37. In 30 Edward III he was sent in Nuncio Domini Regis to Flanders. Footnote: Edom, page 214, mem. Not numbered. In 31 Edward III on another mission. Footnote: Edom, page 217, mem. 18. In 32 Edward III with John de Beauchamp, Banneret, to Holland, Flanders, Zeeland, etc. Footnote: Edom, page 220, mem. 15. These are the most important examples of such employment, but many other esquires, notably John Padbury, who in 1368 was an esquire servant. Footnote: Issues, page 294, mem. 20, page 211, mem. 7, page 214, mem. 23, page 218, mem. 2, etc. Made occasional voyages. Rewards. The regular pay of an esquire of the household was 7d halfpenny a day. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1380, page 539, 1378, page 288. The pay of a king's sergeant at arms was 12d a day, a sum usually granted for life. Footnote: Richard Inworth, Thomas Stafford, Thomas Staples, Walter de Leicester, etc., had grants of 12d daily for life. It is to be observed, however, that the sergeants at arms received very few other grants. The esquires, on the other hand, received extremely valuable grants in great numbers. In particular, they were given annuities, grants of land, grants of office, custody of lands belonging to heirs under age, usually with marriage of the heir, and cordies at monasteries. Taking up the first of these, I shall confine myself to the esquires of 1368, since from Chaucer's position in the lists in that year and in 1369, they would seem to be the men with whom Chaucer is to be associated. In stating the amounts of the annuities, I shall give the total sum which each man received. The names follow in the order of the lists of 1368. Johann de Herling, L40, plus L20 plus L13, 10s. 1d, plus L12, 10s. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 133. Water Whittor, L40. Footnote, Edom 1386, page 146. Thomas Shane, L20. Footnote, Issues A, 169 mem. 16. Johann de Beverley, L40, 8s. 9d. Footnote, Devon's Issues 1370, page 35. Johann de Romsey, L20. Footnote, Edom, page 29, Issues, page 258, mem. 14. Water Walsh, L20. Sevens Hugh-Wake, L40. Footnote, Devon's Issues 1370, page 372. Roger Cleberry, L10. Footnote, page 216, mem. 38. Piers de Cornwall, L40. Footnote, page 241, mem. 11. Robert de Ferrers, no annuity found. Elman Leggett, 20 m. Footnote, Pat. Roll 260 mem. 3. Robert de Corby, L10. Footnote, Edom 291 mem. 1. Collard d'Abrichecourt, L10. Footnote, Edom 281 mem. 18. Thomas Hawting, L10. Footnote, Issues, page 250 mem. 2. Hugh Shane, 10 m. Footnote, Pat. Roll 255 mem. 26. Thomas Vauxhall, no information whatever. Footnote, outside of these lists I have been able to find no information about these men. Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Still, L20. Footnote, Devon's Issues 1370, page 301. Simon de Berg, L10 plus 10 m. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, pages 189, 192. Johann Titchemarsh, no information whatever. Footnote, see note, preceding page. Robert La Soche, L10. Footnote, Issues, page 228, mem. Esmond Rose, and wife, Agnes Archer, 40 m. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378 p. 187. Lawrence Hawberk, knows certain information as Esquire. Griffith de la Chamber, L20. Footnote, Issues, page 2 mem. 12. Cal Pat. 1378, page 157. Johann de Thorpe, 10 m. 4. Roland Urchadaken, no information whatever. Footnote, see note, preceding page. Ralph de Nivton, 10 m. Footnote, Devon's Issues, 1370, page 156. Thomas Hertfordingbury, L10. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1375, page 217. Hugh Strelly, 40 m. Footnote, Pat. Roll 295, mem. 4. Hugh Lingen, L20. Footnote, Pat. Roll 1399, 176. Nicholas Priage, 10 m. Footnote, Devon's Issues 1370, page 216. Richard Toperl, 12d. Daily. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, p. 150. Richard Worrell, no annuity. Johann Northrug, 10 m. Footnote, Issues, page 237, mem. 1 foot 7 inches, Hannon Narrett, L10. Footnote, Edom, page 237, mem. 17. Simon de Bokenham, L10. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 165. Johann Legge, 12d. Daily 14. Footnote, Edom, page 186. In only 2 cases in which we find other information about an esquire do we find no annuity. In a few cases, I have been able to find out nothing at all about the men. In all others, annuities ranging from 10 marks up to L86 are found. Apparently then the receipt of an annuity was absolutely a normal feature of the career of an esquire. None of the other forms of grants was given so systematically and uniformly as that of annuities, but all of the others were very common. The nature and extent of the grants of land, and of guardianships, will appear in the accounts of the careers of individual esquires. They are so irregular in their character, are changed so frequently, and are given on such varying conditions, that an accurate list could scarcely be made. The matter of grants of offices, particularly in the customs, is, however, more easy to handle. At the time when Chaucer was given his controllership, offices in the customs seem to have been used regularly as sinecures for the esquires. In 1353 Griffith the Law Chamber was granted the office of gauging of wine in the towns of Len and Great Yarmouth. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 11. At the same time Roger Cleberry received a similar grant. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1352, page 411. In 1343 William de Clopton had a grant for life of the collectorship of the Port of London with wages of L20. Apparently he did not actually exercise the office because certain merchants to whom the king had farmed the customs of the realm were directed to pay him his wages. Footnote: C. R. 1343, page 194. In 1347 he and John Hurling, another esquire, were collectors of the petty customs in London. Footnote: Rymer, Volume 3, page 115. In 1352 and again in 1355 his deputy is specifically mentioned. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, 1352, page 327, c. R. 1355, page 166. In 1346 John de Hurling was granted the office of Controller of Customs in Boston, Pat. Roll, page 204. In 1348 he was granted the office of Controller of Wools, Hides and Woolfells, Wines and all other merchandise at Newcastle upon Tyne with this added provision. Furthermore, because he stays continually in the King's company by his order, he may substitute for himself a deputy, in the said office, etc. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 130. In 1352 he was Controller of the Customs in the Port of Boston and likewise in that of Len, with provision in the same terms as those above for a deputy in the latter office, and Collector of the Petty Custom in London, with deputy. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, 1352, pages 327, 348, 355. In 1359 he surrendered the office of Controller of Customs at Boston for an annuity of 10 marks. Footnote: Edom. 1378, page 133. At one time he was also Controller in the port of St. Botolph. Footnote: Devon's Issues, 1370, page 381. From the fact that the records show Hurling was constantly in the King's Court, it is clear that he exercised all these offices by deputy. In 35 Edward III Helming Legate was granted the office of Keeper of the smaller piece of the seal for recognizances of debts in London. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll 1377-8, page 184, with power to execute the office by deputy. He held this office until 1389. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 106. Edmund Rose held the office of Keeper of the smaller piece of the seal in Norwich, with deputy. Footnote: Edom 1384, page 380. John de Thorpe was in 1380 appointed Controller of Customs of Wines, Wools, etc. at Southampton on condition that he execute the office in person. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 564. Walter Whitwer held the offices of Keeper of the smaller piece of the seal in York, in 1348, and Troninger of Wool in the port of Len in 1352 with deputy in both offices. Footnote: Edom, pages 143, 293. In addition to offices in the customs, places as Parker of a King's Forest, or Keeper of a royal castle were frequently given to the esquires. So Hugh Shane in 1378 had the custody of Shrewsbury Castle with wages of 7 pence halfpenny therefore. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 248. Helming Legate and Thomas Shane at various times held the office of Constable of Windsor Castle. Footnote: Pat. Roll 279 mem. 33. John de Beverley and Robert Corby likewise had the constableship of the Castle of Leeds. Footnote: Edom 272 mem. 27 Exchequer K. R. Accounts 393-7. William Archibald was Forester of the Forest of Braden. Footnote Pat. Roll 290 mem. 13. John de Beverley was Parker of Eltham Parks. Footnote Cal Pat. Roll 1378-80, page 143. Walter Whitwer in 1349 was steward of the Forest of Galtrace. Many more examples of such grants of offices could be given. Many of the esquires received cordies, in most cases probably commuted for a certain yearly sum. For example, William Archibald held a eordy at Glastonbury from 49 Edward III, footnote, c. r. 213 mem. 17. On and yet in 1378 is stated in the patent rolls to have been retained to stay with the king. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll, page 135. So it could be shown in most cases that esquires holding cordies did not by any means live constantly in their monasteries. William Gambon, especially, could scarcely have done so since he held cordies at Salop, Shrewsbury, Hales, Haling, St. Oswald de Nostell, Coventer, and Wenlock, at the same time. Footnote C. R. 235, mem. 22 Dorso. Other esquires who held cordies and the names of their monasteries follow: John Beauchamp, Pressure, Wigorn. Footnote C. R. 228, mem. 4 Dorso. John Salisbury, Stanley. Footnote Edom 235, mem. 31 Dorso. Simon de Bokenham, Ely. Footnote C. R. 235, mem. 26 Dorso. Helming Legit, Ramsey. Footnote C. R. 235, mem. 10 Dorso. Roger Clebery, Shrewsbury. Footnote Kelsey. R. 1356, page 334. Peter Cornwall, Reading. Footnote C. R. 215, mem. 7 Dorso. John Hurling, Convent of Church of Christ, Canterbury. Footnote C. R. 222, mem. 29 Dorso. Hugh Lingen, Dunstable. Footnote C. R. 226, mem. 26 Dorso. Stephen Romelo, Bardenay. Footnote C. R. 221, mem. 41 Dorso. Grants of wine are scarcely so common as the other kinds of grants, and, so far as I have found, they are not usually given to prominent esquires. John Roos had a grant of 2 tons of wine yearly. Footnote Cal Pat. Roll 1384, page 446. William Recipe of 1 dolium, or 2 pipes of Gascon wine. Footnote Pat. Roll 289 mem. 25. William Street and William Archibald each of 1 ton of Gascon wine yearly. Footnote Cal Pat. Roll 1378, pages 135, 227. John de Beverley and Thomas Shane each of 2 dolia of Gascon wine yearly. Footnote Pat. Roll 271 mem. 21. And Hugh Lingen of 1 ton of red wine of Gascony yearly. Footnote Cal Pat. Roll 1399, page 185. One feature of the form of royal grants remains to be mentioned. Writers on Chaucer have frequently called attention to the fact that his grants contain a statement that they are made for good service done. Footnote C.F. Hales, Lounsbury Ante. This is merely a regular part of the form of a grant. Any enrollments of grants, such as those noted on the preceding page, will give examples of the use of this phrase. Further, the form of grant practically always includes a characterization of the grantee as Delectus Valetus, Delectus Serviens, Delectus Armiger, etc. Marriage. The wives of the esquires came chiefly from 2 classes: first, the damicelli, of the queen's retinue, and second, the daughters and heiresses of country gentlemen. Esquires who married wives from the second class frequently owed a great part of their importance in the county to the estates which their wives brought. So, frequently in the county histories occurs an account of some esquire whose family and antecedents the writer has been unable to trace, but who was prominent in the county, sheriff perhaps or knight of the shire, as a result of the lands he held in right of his wife. An example of this is Helming Legate, who was Member of Parliament for Essex in 7 and 9 Henry IV, and Sheriff in 1401 and 1408. He had married Alice, daughter and co-heir of Sir Thomas Mandeville, and received the estates of Stapleford Taney, Bromfield, Chatham Hall in Great Waltham, and Eastwick in Hertfordshire. Footnote: Morant's Essex Volume 2, page 75, Volume 1, Part 2, page 179. Similarly, John de Salisbury, who had received from the king a grant of the custody of the estates of John de Hastang defunct, and of the marriage of the latter's daughter and heir Johanna, married the lady himself and held in her right extensive lands. Footnote: Pat. Roll 292 mem. 21, Eden 289 mem. 30, Dugdale's Warwick, page 313. John Beauchamp married Joan, daughter and heir of Robert le Fitzwith. Footnote: Ancient Deeds, 8171. Simon de Bokenham married Matilda Durand, who brought him the only land he possessed at his death. Footnote: Pat. Roll 267 mem. 7, Inquiry P. M. Volume 3, page 173. Hugh Shane married Joan, daughter and heir of John de Woodford. Footnote: Abbreviation Rot. Originally 264. Robert Corby married Alice, daughter and heir of Sir John Gowsall. Footnote: Hastings Kent 2 for 28. Collard d'Abrichecourt married Elizabeth, daughter and heir of Sibylla, daughter of Thomas de Say, and held in her right Strathfield Say. Footnote: Belts. Of Garter, page 90 ff. Woodworth, Wilkes, Lockhart, Hampshire 3, 274. George Felbrigg married Margaret, daughter of Elizabeth Dame de Spall, and received with her certain lands in Norfolk and Suffolk. Footnote: Abstracts and Indexes. Duchy of Lancaster I, 157. Robert Ferrers married Elizabeth Boteler, daughter and heir of William Boteler of Wem. Footnote: Dugdale I. 269. Cal Inquiry P.M. Ill, 333. John Legge married Agnes de Northwood, co-heir of the Manor of Vertindon in Surrey. Footnote: Manning Surrey I. 85. Hugh Wake married Joan de Wolverton and received lands with her. Footnote: Baker's Northampton 2, 252. Walter Walsh married Joan Dwill, widow of John Fletcher, called Bell, and received with her the house of Graveberry, which she and her former husband had held. Footnote: Pat. Roll 290 mem. 14. Walter Whitmore married Mabel, daughter and co-heir of Philip Nywham, or Newnham. Footnote: Dugdale's Warwickshire, page 86. Even more interesting, because of their analogy with Chaucer's marriage, are the instances of marriage with the Queen's damsels. In one case, at least, this kind of alliance was considered a meritorious action on the part of the esquire concerned, for not only did he receive an annuity therefor, but ever afterwards when a payment was made on the annuity, the circumstances were given in full. To Edmund Rose, Validas, to whom the king has given £10 per annum to be received at the Exchequer, for good service rendered to the king and because he has married Agnes Archer, formerly damsel to Queen Philippa. Footnote: Issues, page 210, page 204, mem. 5, etc. Similarly, Roger Archer, called Esquire Ma Dame, and in the grant, valet to Isabella, daughter of Edward III, married Alexandra de la Motte, damsel to Isabella. Footnote: Pat. Roll 273 mem. 8. Issues, page 213, mem. 22. It is curious that in both these cases the maiden name of the wife is given in the issue rolls for years after the grant of the annuities. In the other cases, only the surname of the husband is given. These cases are Walter Wight and Margaret Wight. Footnote: Issues, page 221 mem. 11. Thomas and Catherine Spiggernell. Footnote: LR page 172, CR 1357, page 351, 404, 438. John and Elmisha de Beverley. Footnote: LRP 172, Cal Inquiry PM 3, 29. John and Stephanetta Olney. Footnote: LR page 172. Issues, page 241, mem. 8. Robert and Joan Louth. Footnote: LR page 172. Pat. Roll 264, MEM. 39. Piers and Alice Preston, footnote, Pat. Roll 1378, page 125. Hugh and Agatha Lingen, footnote, Issues, page 272, MEM. 13. And John and Margaret Ramsay. Footnote, Edom, page 200, MEM. 19. Holmes Wilts, 100 of Cawdon, page 13. The Careers of the Individual Esquires. In the preparation of this study, I have collected all the facts I could find about the Esquires of 1368. Footnote, a statement of the facts will be found deposited in the University of Chicago Library. Since the essential facts about them have been discussed in the preceding pages, however, I shall present in detail the careers of only 3 or 4 typical esquires. Of the others, John de Hurling, for many years usher of the King's Chamber, received many grants from the King and held many offices. Thomas Shane, footnote, cf. Froissart XX, 562, keeper of the royal jewels, fought in the wars in France and received grants of lands and wardships. John de Romsey acted at various times as royal messenger, and as royal treasurer at Calais. Walter Walsh, another usher of the King's Chamber, received the custody of the possessions of an alien abbey, and the grant of a house and land. Hugh Wake made journeys on the King's service and received some grants. Roger Clebury and Piers de Cornwall received a few grants. Robert de Ferrers had the grant of a manor. Helming Legett, for years receiver of the King's Chamber, had many grants of land and custodies. Robert de Corby had the grant of a manor. Collard d'Abrichecourt had grants of manors and offices. Thomas Hawdine received 1 custody and 1 grant of land in Ely. Hugh Shane had a few grants. The only Thomas Foxall I find trace of, who died in 30 Edward III, received some grants. Simon de Burgh is mentioned in many financial transactions of the time, and he was for some time treasurer of Calais. Of John Titchmarsh, I find no mention, and of Robert La Soche very little. Esmond Rose was keeper of the King's horses. Information about Lawrence Hawberk is ambiguous since there seem to have been 2 or more men of that name. Griffith de la Chamber and John de Thorpe received minor grants. Of Roland Erchidink I find no mention. Thomas Hertfordingbury, Hugh Strelly, Hugh Lingen, Nicholas Priage and Richard Torpro received various small grants. Richard de Worrell appears only as an esquire of John of Gaunt. About John Northrug and Hannah Narrett, I find very little. Simon de Bokenham was chief sergeant of the King's larder, and John Legge, who seems to have been really an esquire at arms, met his death in the Peasants' Revolt. Walter Whitore. Walter Whitore is mentioned in the records first in 1343 when he received an order granting him his wages for life, and the custody of the river Posse for life. Footnote, c. r. page 203. In 1346 he was granted 2 marriages, in 1347, 5 marks a year, the tronageship of Len, and the constableship of Conisborough Castle. Footnote, Calpat. Roll, pages 37, 69, 234, 451, 545. In 1348 the King granted Whitore all the tenements and rents in the city of London which were in the King's hands by reason of the forfeiture of a certain William de Morden. Footnote, Calpat. Roll, page 48. In the same year he was given the custody of the smaller piece of the seal for recognizances of debts in the city of York. Footnote, Edom, page 148. In 1349 he received a grant of forfeited houses in the county of York. Footnote, Edom, page 261, and likewise a mill and more lands forfeited by William de Morden. Footnote, Edom, page 333. Furthermore he was given in the same year the right to dispose of some of these latter lands. Footnote, Edom, page 440. In 1349 further he was granted the stewardship of the forest of Galtrace, and the roots of all trees cut down in that forest. Footnote, Edom, pages 368, 433, apparently with deputy, for in Calpat. Roll 1352, page 214, a lieutenant is mentioned. In 1352 the office of tronage of the wools at Len was granted to his former deputy, at the request of Walter Whitore who surrendered a grant of that office. Footnote, Edom, pages 267, 293. Next year he was given an annuity of 20 marks, and also the right to exercise the office of recognizances of debts by deputy, because he stays continually in the king's service, at his side. Footnote: Edom, pages 380–498. In the same year he was granted the custody of the forest of Linton, adjacent to Galtrace. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 417. In 1360 Whitwer was granted certain houses in York formerly belonging to Richard de Snawshall. Footnote: Pat. Roll 256, mem 5, and also the custody of the lands and tenements formerly belonging to Nicholas de Lytton, during the minority of the heir. Footnote: Edom, mem 18. In 1361 he was given a messuage and shop formerly owned by Walter Ragowne in London and worth 40 shillings yearly. Footnote: Edom 261 mem 12. From a document of the same year we learn something about the marriage of his daughter. By this document Stephen Whiteslade, cousin and heir of Thomas Branch, acknowledged a debt of £200 to Whitwer, which is to be paid in the form of an annuity of 12 marks to Mary, daughter of Whitwer and widow of Thomas Branch. She is to have further as dower certain manors in Norfolk and Surrey. Her husband had been a ward of her father's and had died a minor. Footnote: C. R. Page 134. In 1363 Whitwer was pardoned the payment of all moneys which he had drawn in advance from the wardrobe. Footnote: Pat. Roll 262, mem 15. Likewise in the same year he had a grant of the marriage of the son and heir of John Colville, Chevalier, defunct. Footnote: Edom 262, mem 18. In 1363 he received a grant of the custody of the Palace of Westminster, and the prison of the Fleet. Footnote: Edom 265, mem 15. And of the custody of all lands and tenements formerly the property of William Broyne, defunct. Footnote: Edom, mem 17. In 1365 Whitwer had a grant of the manor of Naburn with pertinences in York, formerly the property of a felon. Footnote: Edom 270 mem 34. In 1370 he was granted free warren in Brenchisham, Surrey. Footnote: Cal Rot. Chart, page 187. And in the same year and nearly until his death, he had an annuity of 40 marks a year as usher or doorkeeper of the King's Free Chapel of Windsor. For this office also he received 12 pence a day, because that the same Lord the King charged the same Walter to carry a wand in the presence of the said Lord the King, before the college, when the King personally should be there, and that the same Walter might be able more easily to support that charge. Footnote: Devon's Issues, page 101. In that year likewise he was sent to York to borrow money from divers abbots, priors and others for the king's use. Footnote: Edom, page 111. In 1373 he and Isabella his wife acquired by a devious series of transfers a messuage of land with reversion to their son Walter. Footnote: Pat. Roll 287, mem 4. In 1377 Gerard Brocas acknowledged a debt of 160 m. to Walter Whitwer. Footnote: C. R. 216, mem 8 Dorso. In 1377 he was granted the lands and tenements of Simon Ronville, defunct, and the marriage of his heiress to Ralph, son of Walter Whitwer. In 1383 he was still exercising the office of custodian of the smaller piece of the seal for York by deputy. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 242. 3 years later the king at his supplication granted his annuity of 40 marks to another. Footnote: Edom, page 146. In 1387 he was apparently dead, for the king granted to another the office of usher of St. George's Chapel, and the house which he had occupied. Footnote: Edom, page 297. According to Dugdale, Walter Whitwer married Mabel, daughter and co-heir of Philip Newnham, or Newnham, of Newnham Paydocks in Warwick. Their son and heir was Sir Ralph Whitehorse K.T. Footnote: Warwickshire, page 86. John de Beverley. John de Beverley is particularly interesting to us because in 1376 he was joined with Chaucer as surety for William de Beauchamp when the latter received the custody of the castle and county of Pembroke. Footnote: L. R. page 213, The first mention of him in the public records occurs in 36 Edward III, when he was granted the custody of all the lands and tenements of James de Pabenham, knight, defunct, during the minority of the heir. Footnote: Pat. Roll 265, MEM. 17. And when he and Amicia de Boxshall his wife were granted £20 yearly by the king. Footnote: Edom 266, MEM. 29. In the next year he was granted the office of constable of the castle of Limerick and certain water rights at the same place. Footnote: Item 267, MEM. 6. 8. In 38 Edward III John de Beverley, who was holding the manor of Penkridge, Staffordshire, from the king in Capite, having acquired it from John, son and heir of Hugo Blunt, was pardoned the transgression committed in entering upon it. In the same year he was granted the right to hold a fair at Pencrick. Footnote: Cal Rot. Chart, page 185. In 39 Edward III, he received a grant of 2 tenements in the parish of St. Michael at Corn, London. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur Lawn, page 179b. At the customary rent, he established a chantry. Footnote: Inquiry ad. Quod Damnum, page 335, and received a grant of the constableship of the castle of Leeds for life, with wages 100s. Therefore. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur Lawn, page 180. In 39 to 40 Edward III, he was granted the right of free warren in Mendelsdon. Footnote: Cal Rot. Chart, page 185, Hertfordshire. In 39 Edward III, he was granted the manor of Mendelsdon. Footnote: Pat. Roll 272, MEM. 4. And 2 dolia of Gascon wine yearly. Footnote: Edom 271, MEM. 21. In 40 Edward III, the king granted his mother, Matilda, a number of tenements and shops in London. Footnote: Edom 274, MEM. 2. He himself was in that year granted the manor of Buchenholz for life, with reversion to his heirs. Footnote: Edom 278, MEM. 37. And the custody of the manor of Melton in Kent during the minority of the heir. Footnote: Edom 274, MEM. 43. He seems also in that year to have sold to the Count of Arundel and others his manor of Pencrick. Footnote: Edom 273, MEM. 13. In 41 Edward III John de Beverley was granted the manor of Bofford in Oxford. Footnote: Edom 276, MEM. 6. In the next year he was granted the right to hunt in the parks and forests of the king, with this prologue: Reduns ad memoriam obsequia et servitia placida que delectus armiger noster Johannes de Beverley nobis non absci periculis et rerum dispendius a longo tempore impendit, etc. Footnote: Pat. Roll 278, MEM. 8. In 43 Edward III permission was given to Walter Bygod, Miles, to grant at farm to John de Beverley the manors of Alfreston, Essex, and Marham, Norfolk, at a rent of L200 to Walter Bygod. Footnote: Edom 279, MEM. 12. In that year also a grant by Ingeram de Courcy to John de Beverley of the manor of Tremworth in Kent was confirmed by the king. Footnote: Edom 280, MEM. 28. Finally he was granted the parkership of Eltham Forest for life with pay of 3 pence per day. Footnote: Edom 279, MEM. 28. He was at this time drawing an annuity of L48s. 9d. For life, and he was also paid, in this year, 1370, L107, 15ths. 5d. For his wages and those of his men at arms and archers in the war. Footnote: Devon's Issues 1370, pages 35, 81. In 1371 he was paid 100 m. Footnote: Reimer, Old Edition 7, 178. In 44 Edward III the king granted John de Beverley the manor of Rawford in Oxfordshire. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur. Lawn, page 186. Era for Bofford, and the custody of the lands of John de Canes, defunct, during the minority of his heir. Footnote: Pat. Roll 281, MEM. 2. In 46 Edward III the king granted him the custody of all the lands of Walter Bigod, Chevalier, in Essex and Norfolk, with marriage of the heir. Footnote: Edom 287 mem. 5. He was also in that year granted an annuity of 33s. 4d. And the manor of Rodbaston in Staffordshire. Footnote: Edom 287 mem. 1834. The next year, John de Beverley received a grant of the reversion to 2 parts of the manor of Goddington in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, and also of the manor of Bulkenhall in Oxfordshire. Footnote: Edom 289 mem. 17. He was at that time paying £10 yearly for the farm of the manor of Goddington. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur. Lawn, page 188. In 48 Edward III he received a grant of the goods and chattels of Thomas de Laubert, an outlaw. Footnote: Pat. Roll 290 mem. 8. And also of all the trees cut down in Eltham Forest. Footnote: Edom 290 mem. 10. Finally he had a grant of the manor of Bikenhull, sic. Footnote: Edom 290 mem. 30. In 49 Edward III he was granted certain tenements and rents in London. Footnote: Edom 292 mem. 28. In 50 Edward III, he and his wife acquired the manor of Pencrick, Stafford, from Thomas, son of Hugo Blunt, Knight. Footnote: C. R. mem. 1. And he was granted custody of the lands of John Ferrers, Knight, with marriage of the heir. Footnote: Pat. Roll 295 mem. 23. In 1377 he was one of the witnesses to Edward II's will. Footnote: Tess Vet, page 12. In 1377 he testified against Alice Purse before Parliament. He said that she took care not to say anything about the matter under dispute before him. Il soy gardes bien de lui tuili any par la reine en sa présence. Footnote: Rot. Parliament, page 14. In 1377 we find an acknowledgment of 100 marks which John de Beverley had lent to the king for the expeditions oversea. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 29, and in this year he is said to have been armor-bearer to the king. Footnote: Duncan's Oxfordshire I, 197. Edward III. In 1 Richard II, he acquired a rent of 40 shillings from lands and tenements in Buckenhall. Footnote: MS. Kelsey, R. Page 14. In 1378 certain men were imprisoned for a debt of £100 to John de Beverley and Joan de Bocking. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 130. And in that year he paid £20 for leave to alienate certain property of 6 marks rent which he held from the king. In 1378 he was retained to serve Richard II and confirmed in his possession of the office of Parker of Eltham Parks, an annuity of £10 and the fee farm rent of £81 for the manor of Headingham. Footnote: Al Pat. Roll, page 143. In 1380 his office of Constable of the Castle of Leeds, the profits of the mills there and the custody of the park there, were exchanged for £10 to be deducted yearly from his rent of £20 paid to the king for the manor of Tremworth. Footnote: Edom, page 506. In 1381 John de Beverley was dead, leaving 7 manors and other property. Footnote: Cal Enquiry P. M. 329. In 17 Richard II his wife, Amicia, had become the wife of Robert Bardolph, Miles. Footnote: C. R. 235, mem. In the index to his Froissart, Kervin de Lettenhove describes John de Beverley as Mold Grand Baron d'Angleterre, and refers to a list of chevaliers who were going to Portugal in 1384 with the Master of the Order of St. James. Footnote: Cf. Reimer Old Edition 7 451. This was certainly not our John de Beverley because the latter was dead in 1381. Geoffrey Stuckle. The first mention I find of Geoffrey Stuckle is in 1347 when he had a grant of the bailiwick of Cork in Ireland made at the request of Henry, Earl of Lancaster. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 367. This grant was confirmed by one of 32 Edward III, an inspeximus and confirmation of letters patent of Maurice, Count d'Essimond, according to which Maurice granted the bailiwick of Cork to Geoffrey Steuchel at the request of Lionel, Count of Ulster. According to this last document, Steuchel had the office with all its fees and privileges, and was to pay for it a rose yearly at the feast of St. John the Baptist. Footnote Pat. Roll 255, MEM. 29. In 1348 also a statement is made that Steuchel is going to Brittany on the king's service. In 29 Edward III Steuchel appears under entirely different circumstances. He is then Veletus of the Countess of Ulster, and is paid 40 shillings and 60 shillings for attending to certain business of the Countess. Footnote: Issues, page 212, MEM. 22, 27. Again he is mentioned as Valetus of the Countess of Ulster, staying in London on her affairs, and paid 60 shillings therefor. Footnote: Edom, page 294, 214, MEM. 23. In 31 Edward III he had a grant, as Valetus, of the king's household, of 10 marks per annum, for good services to the king, etc. Footnote: Issues, page 217, MEM. 14. Evidently then Steuchel came into the king's household, just as Chaucer did, from the household of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster, and it is to be noted that he received an annuity within a year or a little more, possibly as soon as he shifted to the king's service. In the same year he was sent on a mission of the king's and paid 20 six. 8d. Footnote: Edom, MEM. 18. In 33 Edward III he was sent on the king's secret business to Normandy, and paid L16, 13s.4d. for his wages. Footnote: Edom, page 223, MEM. 17. He was paid £10 more in the same year for a mission of the king, possibly the same as the foregoing. Footnote: Edom, page 222, MEM. 20. In 35 Edward III he was sent on the king's business to Normandy and paid £10 for his wages. Footnote: Item 169, MEM. 30. Likewise in the same year he was paid £20 for his wages in going to France and Normandy in the diplomatic service of the king, possibly the same as the foregoing. Footnote: Item 169, MEM. 38. In 36 Edward III he was paid £10 for going on another journey. Footnote: Issues, page 228, MEM. 2. And L6 13s.4d. for a journey on the king's business to Brittany. Footnote: Edom, page 229, MEM. 25. In the same year he was paid 60 shillings for his robe. Footnote: Idem. In 37 Edward III he was sent to Jersey in the company of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster. Footnote: Edom, p. 232, MEM. 20. And his annuity was increased to 20 marks. Footnote: Pat. Roll 267, MEM. 21. In 38 Edward III Steuchel was granted, at his own request, custody of all lands and tenements which were formerly the property of Richard de la Reyniere, defunct, during the minority of the heir. Footnote: Edom 269, MEM. 43. In 39 Edward III he went on a diplomatic mission to the Duke of Brittany, and was paid L26, 13s.4d. Therefore. Footnote: Issues, page 239, MEM. 31. In 40 Edward III he was granted 1 tenement and 2 shops in the parish of St. Michael over Cornhill, London. Footnote: Pat. Roll 273, MEM. 35. In 41 Edward III he was paid £40 for a mission to Spain. Footnote: Issues, page 248, MEM. Not numbered. In 42 Edward III he was paid £40 for a journey to the Prince of Aquitaine. Footnote: Issues, page 249, MEM. 4. In 1370 he was given 10 marks in addition to his wages for the 5 voyages which he had made to Calais for the king. Footnote: Devon's Issues, page 409. In that year also he was sent on secret business of the king to Nottingham. Footnote: Idem. In 47 Edward III, Steuchel was sent to Flanders with certain letters of privy seal directed to various bannerets and knights of the king's retinue who were staying in Germany, directing them to prepare themselves to go with John, Duke of Lancaster, to France on the king's business. Footnote: Issues, page 262, mem. 9. For this he was paid L13, 6s.8d. And he received £10 more for a journey to Flanders with letters directed to Simon, Archbishop of Canterbury. Footnote: Edom 264, mem. Not numbered. In 49 Edward III he was sent to Bruges to report to the council the results of the conference between the ambassadors of the king and the King of France for a treaty of peace. Footnote: Edom, page 271, mem. 17. In the same year he was granted custody of all the lands and tenements formerly belonging to John Dakenay, Chevalier, defunct, with marriage of the heir. Footnote: Pat. Roll 293, mem. 19. George Felbrigg. In 50 Edward III he was paid £10 for transacting certain arduous business pertaining to the king in Flanders. Footnote: Issues, page 273, mem. 20. In 1 Richard II, Stuckel was sent to Leicester with a letter of private seal directed to John, King of Castile and Leon, Duke of Lancaster, certifying to the Duke the death of the Countess of March and excusing the Count of March on that account from his journey to the north. Footnote: Edom 295, mem. 11. In the same year he was sent to the north with a letter directed to John of Lancaster ordering the latter to come to London to the King's Council. Footnote: Edom 295, mem. 17. In 2 Richard II he was paid 100 shillings for a journey to various parts of England to get money for a royal expedition. Footnote: Edom, page 298, mem. 23. In 1378 his grant of an annuity, here stated to be £20, was confirmed and he was retained in the King's service. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 181. In 10 Richard II it is stated that Richard de la Paintree had married his widow. Evidently he had not been dead long, for the king paid to his widow L37, es.8d. due to him. Footnote: Issues, page 315, mem. 11. Mention of George Felbrigg first occurs in 34 Edward III when he was granted an annuity of 20 marks. Footnote: Pat. Roll 261, mem. 2. In 37 Edward III George Felbrigg and William Ellis were granted the farm of all the customs except those of wool and woolfells in the town of Magna Jermouth for 1 year. Footnote: Edom 268, mem. 49. They seem to have held this farm for a number of years, certainly in 40 and 41 Edward III, by yearly grants and at a rent of £22 per annum. Footnote: Fine Roll 167, mem. 10, 168, mem.16. In 1370 he was paid L31, 11s. 10d. for the expenses of himself, his men-at-arms, and archers in the war. Footnote: Devon, page 440. In 44 Edward III he was receiving an annuity of £20. Footnote: Devon's Issues, page 66. And in the same year he had a grant at farm of the hundred of Northerpingham and Southerpingham, paying £50 yearly therefor. Footnote: Fine Roll 171, mem. 26. In 47 Edward III he was granted custody of the Priory of Toasts at a farm of £63 yearly. Footnote: Edom 174, mem. 16. In 48 Edward III the bailiff of fees, etc., in Norfolk and Suffolk was ordered by the Duke of Lancaster to deliver the lands and tenements late belonging to Elizabeth, Dame de Spal, to George de Felbrigg, who had married Margaret, daughter of the said Elizabeth. Footnote: Abstracts and Indexes, Long Room Rec. Off. I. 157 Dorso. In 49 Edward III he was granted a messuage with pertinences in Grippewick. Footnote: Pat. Roll 293, mem. 3. In 50 Edward III he had a grant of the Bulliva, of the hundred of Rockford in Essex, and also of the custody of Haddow Castle. Footnote: Abbreviation Rot. Originally 2. 310. In 51 Edward III he was sent on secret business of the king to John, Duke of Brittany, in Flanders, and paid L13, sixs. 8d. for his wages for the journey. Footnote: Issues, page 274, mem. 11. In 1377 he is said to have been one of the jury that found Alice Purse guilty of maintenance. Footnote: Blomfield's Norfolk 8, 107 ff. Certainly he witnessed against her before Parliament. Footnote: Rot. Parliament, page 14. In 2 Richard II he was sent on secret business of the king with John de Burgh and others to Milan. For the voyage he received L23 SIXS. 8d. Footnote: Issues, page 298 mem. 20. In 4 Richard II he was sent to the King of the Romans and of Bohemia on secret business connected with the marriage of the king, and paid L66 13s. 4d. For the journey. Footnote: Issues, page 303 mem. 2. In 1382 he and John Hurling acquired a messuage and 60 acres of land. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 121. In 5 Richard II he was paid for a certain voyage to Germany L75, SIXS. 8d. And for a voyage on King's secret business to Flanders, £10. Footnote: Issues, page 304, mem. 19, page 305, mem. 13. In 1384 he was granted for life the £10 yearly due from him from the issues of the Castle of Colchester. In this document his services as King's messenger beyond the seas are expressly mentioned. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 367. He seems to have had custody of the Castle of Colchester, for when later in 1384 the king granted it to Robert de Vere, he gave instead £40 yearly to George Felbrigg. Footnote: Edom, pages 440, 442, in 7, 8 Richard II he was granted free warrant for certain estates in Suffolk. Footnote: Cal Rot. Chart, page 190. In 1385 the king granted to George Felbrigg, whom the king on his entry into Scotland had advanced to the rank of knight, £40 yearly to enable him to support his estate more honourably. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 18. He had with him, when he was in the king's expedition to Scotland, 8 esquires and bowmen. Footnote: Issues, page 312, mem. 17. In 11 Richard II George de Felbrugh was sent to the Duke of Gueldres at Middleburg to receive his homage on the part of the king. For his expenses on the journey he was paid £30. Footnote: Edom, page 316, mem. 2. In 1389–92 he was mentioned frequently in the patent rolls as Justice of the Peace in Suffolk. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll Index. In 14 Richard II he was paid £40 for a journey to the King of the Romans, and in 15 Richard II £100 for the same journey. Footnote: Issues, page 323 mem. 5, page 324 mem. 5. In 1399 9 grants made by Richard II to him were confirmed by Henry IV. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 77. In 1401 a George Felbrigg married Anne, late the wife of Robert Charles, knight. Footnote: Edom, page 539. Blomfield gives the following additional information about Felbrigg. In 7 Richard II he and Marjorie his wife held the manors of Wortham and Ingham in Suffolk. About the same time Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, granted to him and Roger Mareschal, Esquire, the manor and park of Standon in Hertfordshire, at Farm. He was one of the king's protectors in the latter's 10th year, and in 15 Richard II, he was one of the lieutenants in the court of chivalry to try the case of Lords Morley and Lovell. His will was dated February 3, 1400. Footnote: Blomfield 8, pages 107 ff. The office of Justice of the Peace developed in England in the 14th century. The main outlines of its growth can be indicated by the statement of a few significant facts. In 1327 it was enacted that good and lawful men be assigned to keep the peace. In 1330 they were given power to return indictments. In 1361 Lord and with him 3 or 4 of the most worthy of the county, with some learned in the law, were given power to arrest malefactors, to receive indictments against them, and to hear and determine at the king's suit all manner of felonies and trespasses done in the county. In 1362 it was directed by statute that the justices should hold sessions 4 times a year, and in 1388 that they should be paid 4 shillings a day during the sessions. Footnote: Summarized from Maitland's Constitutional History and G. E. Howard. Neb. U. Studies, pages 44-53. In 13 Richard II it was enacted that the justices should be the most efficient knights, esquires, and gentlemen of the law of the county. Footnote: though enacted after Chaucer's time as justice, this indicates very nearly a contemporary attitude toward the office. The justices of a given county were derived from 3 classes. Footnote: Encyclopedia of Laws of England, Volume 7, page 587. A. Those appointed by being named in the schedule. The Lord Chancellor made the appointment, usually relying upon the Lord Lieutenant, or the Custos Rotulorum, of the county. B. Virtute officii, i.e., the Lord Chancellor, Lord President of the Privy Council, Lord Privy Seal, Justices of the Supreme Court, etc. C. Holders of minor judicial offices, county judges, etc. Of those named in the list of Justices of the Peace for Kent in 1386, at least 4 fall under Class B: Robert Tressilian, Robert Belknap, David Hanamere, and Walter Clopton were at that time justices in the King's Courts, and their names occur, evidently ex officio, in the lists of justices for many of the counties of England. Since they very likely never sat with the Justices of the Peace in Kent, they may, for our purposes, be disregarded. We cannot be sure that Chaucer ever actually sat on this commission, or that he knew personally any one of his fellow justices. Consequently, there is no intrinsic interest in a study of their individual careers and personalities. But a few notes about them will give us some impression of the type of men with whom Chaucer was associating and the importance of his social position. In the 14th century, the name of the Constable of Dover and Warden of the Cinque Ports always heads the list of justices in Kent. The holder of that office in 1387 was Simon de Burley, one of the most influential men in Richard II's court. This man was not of noble birth. Barnes, quoted by Kervin de Lettenhove, footnote, Froissart XX 487, says that Walter Burley was so renowned for his learning at Oxford that he became the almoner of the Queen, Philippa, and the tutor of the Prince of Wales. One of his relatives, Simon de Burley, was included among the group of young people brought up with the prince, and soon he became the latter's intimate friend, and afterwards one of the tutors of his son, Richard II. He enjoyed the greatest favor under Richard II, and belonged to the group of the king's friends, Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, and Nicholas Brember. He had been connected always with the family of Richard II, a fact illustrated by his being named by Joan, mother of Richard II, one of the executors of her will, 1385. Footnote: Tess Vet, page 15. In 1377 Richard II confirmed to him the King's Father's Knight, a grant of £100 yearly made by the King's Father, and the custody of Curwood Castle. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 223. In the same year he granted de Burley the office of Constable of Windsor Castle for life, the Abbot of Ficamps Manor of Sloter, footnote, Edom, pages 78, 21, 223, rent-free, during the war, and the office of Master of the Falcons. In 1378 he confirmed to de Burley the custody of the Manor of Chiltenham, Gloucester, and the fee simple of the castle and lordship of Longstephen. Footnote: Edom, page 119, 256. In 1382 Richard granted him the office of Under-Chamberlain of the King's household for life, and appointed him surveyor of the lands in South Wales in the King's hands during the minority of the heir of Edmund Mortimer. Footnote: Edom, page 164. In 1384 the King granted him for life the constableship of Dover Castle and the wardenship of the Cinque Ports, and £300 yearly therefor, and for the maintenance of himself, chaplains, etc., with provision that he exercise the office himself. Footnote: Edom, page 367. In 1388 he was attainted of treason with the other favorites of the king and executed. It is reported that people in Kent rose in rebellion to, footnote, Edom, page 78, demonstrate their loyalty to him. At his death Michael de la Pole, William Wingfield and he possessed together extensive lands, and he himself had some 7 manors in Kent. Footnote: Cal Inquiry P. M. 3, 111, 119. The John de Cobham, whose name follows that of de Burley in the list, was one of the most eminent barons of his day. I shall merely outline a few of the most important features in his career. He came of one of the oldest families in Kent. Footnote: Ireland's Kent v. 240 ff. His father had been at various times Admiral of the King's Fleet in the West, Justice in Kent, and Constable of Rochester. His mother was Joan, daughter of John, Lord Beauchamp of Stoke. In 4041 Edward III John de Cobham served in the wars in France. In 41 Edward III he was ambassador to Rome. In 1 Richard II he was a member of the King's Council, served later in France with 3 knights, 105 esquires and 110 men-at-arms, and was made a banneret. In 10 Richard II he was one of the 13 Lord Governors of the realm, appointed to oversee the government of the king. From 1377 on he was on many commissions to treat for peace with foreign powers. In 1387 he was with the 5 Lords Appellant at Waltham Cross, evidently then he was of the party of Gloucester and Arundel. He was Member of Parliament from Kent in 1390, 1394 and 1398. In 1392 he was Lieutenant to the Constable of England, and in the same year he was given a cup in the Earl of Arundel's will. Footnote: Test. Vet. Page 133. With the downfall of Gloucester he fell out of favour. He died in 1409, leaving extensive possessions, 43 items in all, in London, Wiltshire, Kent and Surrey. He married Margaret, daughter of Hugh Courtenay, Earl of Devonshire. On Cobham's cf. Nicholas Hist. Peerage and Kent. Arch SOC 2, page 71. John Clinton came of a prominent Kentish family. He was son of John de Clinton of Maxstoke and Ida de Odingsel. Footnote: Froissart 21, pages 17 ff. He was in the French and Scottish campaigns, was appointed on commissions and was at one time lieutenant of John Devereux, warden of the Cinque Ports. He died in 1396, leaving extensive lands in Kent, 26 items in all. Footnote: Cal Inquiry P. M. 3, 228. He married Marjorie Corbett, of a good Kentish family. John Devereux was son of William Devereux. Edward III attached him to the person of his grandson, Richard II, and gave him 200 marks as a pension. Footnote: Froissart 21, page 94. Statham Hist. Of Dover, page 380. He was in Spain with the Black Prince. In 1377 he was appointed one of the King's Council. Footnote: Rymer Old Edition 7, 161. In 1378 Constable of Leeds Castle for life, and in 1380 Captain of the City of Calais. Footnote: Edom, page 259. He was on many commissions to treat of peace with France and Flanders. Footnote: Edom, 308, 338, 248, and from 1384 on he was frequently summoned to Parliament. In 1386 he was one of the Council of 11 appointed to govern England. From 1386 to 1390, and perhaps longer, he was steward of the King's household. Footnote: Rymer Old Edition 7, 495, 675. In 1387 he was with the Lords Appellant at Waltham Cross. Footnote: Rot. Parliament 3, 229. In 1387 he succeeded Simon de Burley as Constable of Dover and Warden of the Cinque Ports. Footnote: Ireland's Kent I 710. He died in 1394, a Knight of the Garter. Footnote: Belts, page 323, and the possessor, in right of his wife, of the manor of Penshurst, Kent. His only other property seems to have been the manor of Donington in Buckinghamshire. Footnote: Cal Inquiry P. M. 3, 174. Thomas Culpeper came from a great Kentish family which at one time could boast of having 12 members bearing the order of knighthood. Footnote: Kent. Arch 21, 212. A Thomas Culpeper was Member of Parliament for Kent in 1361, and in other later years. Thomas Fogg was Member of Parliament for Kent in 1378, 1380, 1383, 1384, 1388. He held lands by knight's service of the Lord of Poninges, and came, through right of his wife, into part of the property of Warrezens de Valoins. In 1377 he was Constable of the Castle of Calais. Footnote: Rymer 4, 2. He was prominent in the wars of the time, especially in naval action. In 1386 he went to Spain with John of Gaunt. Footnote: Reimer Old Edition 7, 499. In 1405 he died. Footnote: Kent. Arch 18, page 360. William Rick Hill was a justice of the King's Bench. He may have been in the list for that reason, or perhaps because he was an inhabitant of Kent. At any rate, he came of a landed family in Kent. Footnote: Ireland's Kent, 416. He died in Henry IV's reign. John Framingham, son of Sir Ralph Framingham of Lewes, was derived from a prominent Kentish family. Footnote: Edom, 3, 111, Kent Arch 21, 214, 23, 57. He himself is called Chevalier, was Sheriff of Kent in 1378 and 1393, and a Member of Parliament in 1377, 1381 and 1399. He was executor of the will of William Courtenay, Archbishop of Canterbury. He died 12 Henry IV, possessing the manor and advowson of the Church of Otham and Red Court. James de Peckham was of another old Kentish family which can be traced as far back as Richard I. Footnote: Ireland's Kent 3, 529, Kent Arch SOC 21, 214, 28, 210. His great-grandfather possessed the manor of Peckham in Hadlow, Temp. Edward I, and the estates had been increased since that time. James Peckham was Sheriff of Kent in 1377 and 1380 and a Member of Parliament in 1372, 1377, 1383, 1388. William Topcliffe was apparently the only man in the list, except Chaucer, who did not come from a landed Kentish family. He was, however, in 1382 and doubtless later, land steward to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He held a manor in Kent, whether as steward of the Archbishop or of his own right, I have not been able to find out. Footnote: Kent Arch 4, 125. Thomas Brokehill, of Saltwood, Chevalier, derived from a good Kentish family, was sheriff in 1382, 1383, 1385, 1395, 1397, 1399, and 1402. He died in 1437-38, leaving no male heirs. Footnote: Ireland's Kent 2, 218, Kent Arch 21, 215, 18, 422, 3. William Brent Chesley was lord of the manor of Benendon, near Dartford, and a justice of the Common Pleas, in Henry IV's time. Footnote: Kent Arch v. 27, the Customs. Footnote: Aton and Holland, the King's Customs. The duties of the collectors of customs were to ensure payment on all wools and leather shipped from their port, to have the wool or leather weighed at the wool beam and each bale tested and sealed with the government stamp or coquet seal. The collectors, of whom there were 2 in every important port, were clerical officers rather than coast guards, their most arduous duty the preparing and balancing of the accounts which had to be written by their own hands. Their salary was £20 a year each. The controller, who was intended as a check on the collectors, prepared and presented an independent account to the exchequer. He seems to have had no fixed salary, but the collectors were empowered to pay the controller's salary out of the takings. Footnote: Summarized from Hubert Hall, History of the Customs Revenue. The sums thus paid were, however, mostly nominal, in Chaucer's case £10 a year, and it is evident that both collectors and controllers were allowed to levy fees. The collectors of the Port of London during Chaucer's service as controller were 1374 John de Burns and Nicholas Brember, 1375 Brember and William de Walworth, 1376 John Ward and Robert Girdler, 1377 Ward and Richard Northberry, 1378-1384 Brember and John Philippot, 1384-1386 Brember and John Organ. These were in every case prominent citizens and merchants of London, and after 1377, they were members of a clique especially friendly to the king, and inimical to John of Gaunt. To gain the right conception of their relations, one must learn something about London politics. I shall follow Trevelyan's account, footnote, Age of Wycliffe, pages 278 ff, of the factional struggles in the city, which from the documents which he has published and from such evidence as that afforded by the Rolls of Parliament, is unquestionably the correct one. The aldermen of London were the representatives of the companies, the associations of merchants of different sorts, each company choosing a given number according to its influence and wealth. Further, in 1376 a method of electing the mayor and the sheriffs was introduced, which consisted in a vote by companies. Now the most powerful of these companies was the grocers, which at this time had 16 aldermen, many more than its nearest competitor. Allied with this company were the other companies of merchants dealing in provisions, especially the fishmongers. The chief opponents of this group were the companies of clothing merchants, the mercers, drapers, cordwainers, etc. The grocers' company and its allies stood for the established order of things because they were faring well under it. The mercers and drapers were rebellious and ready to take any opportunity to eject their rivals from power. At this time, 1376, John of Gaunt's clique in the court, especially Lord Latimer and Richard Lyons, had aroused the enmity of the Londoners because of their irregular and grafting financial operations. Footnote: Trevelyan, page 10. The Londoners paraded the streets in demonstration against John of Gaunt. The latter demanded revenge and gained the deposition of the mayor, Adam Staple. The Londoners rallied and elected Nicholas Brember mayor. Footnote: Edom, page 49. Brember and his allies defended the Londoners vigorously before Parliament. Naturally then John of Gaunt felt a still greater hatred of Brember and his party, and was willing to act as patron to their opponents. The latter in turn, eager to gain any aid they could in their struggles, willingly accepted John of Gaunt as a friend. This, as clearly as I can make out, is the train of circumstances which brought about an unquestioned condition, John of Gaunt's hatred of London and especially of Brember and his party, and his patronage of John of Northampton, the chief representative of the clothiers. Brember's chief political allies were Sir William Walworth, Sir John Philpot and Nicholas Exton. These men were very definitely patronized by Richard II in opposition to John Northampton, Richard Northberry and John Moore. During Chaucer's tenure of the office of Controller only one certain adherent of the Northampton faction acted as collector, Richard Northberry, who was dropped from the office almost as soon as Richard II came to the throne. The other men with whom Chaucer had to deal were the very leaders of the royal faction. Further, they were the most eminent merchants of their time. In the footnote 3, see Robert Gertelaer, page 46. First half of the 14th century the king had been forced to rely upon foreign, especially Italian, merchants for financial aids, loans, etc., since no group of Englishmen could control sufficient money to aid him in an emergency. Footnote W. D. Chester, Chronicles of the Customs Department, pages 13 ff. But in the second half he had at his hand a group of London merchants, powerful enough to meet the sudden financial needs of government. Moreover, they were picturesque figures, Sir William Walworth striking down Wat Tyler in the presence of the peasant host, Sir John Philpot fitting out a fleet at his own expense, scouring the Channel and finally bringing the dreaded pirate Mercer in triumph to London. John de Burns, collector in 1374, was, in 1360, sheriff, in 1363 and 1370 alderman, of London, and in 45-46, Edward III mayor. In 1370 he lent the king L100, in 1363 he was apparently employed in buying for the king's household. Footnote: Devon's Issues, page 170. Rymer 3, 696. He was dead by 1378, and I have not found out anything more about him. Nicholas Brember, collector 1374, 1375, 1378-1386. See account in D. N. B. Brember was mayor in 1377, April 5, 1383. He was the political leader of the group of King Richard's friends in London. Of his public career I shall not treat since that is sufficiently covered elsewhere. To illustrate his financial dealings, the following abstracts of documents are important. In September 1377, the king borrowed L10,000 of Brember, Walworth, Philpot and John Haddle, grocer, later mayor of London, and certain other merchants, for whom these were attorneys, pledging the crown jewels. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 25. In May 1378 this sum was repaid. In 1378, Hugh de Calvilleg, captain of Calais, Nicholas Brember and John Philpot, in the service of the war, agreed to pay to William Vaughan de Vorda of Bruges the sum of L2, 166/13. 4d. As directed by the council, delivered their bond to the king's clerk, and a tally of that amount was placed in the hands of William de Walworth. Footnote: Cal. Pat. Roll, page 280. In 1382 the king granted Brember in discharge of 2,000 m, lent by him to the king to discharge a debt to Sir Bretricat de Lebret, half a mark from the subsidy of each sack of wool and wool fells passing out of the ports of London and Boston, with custody of one part of the coquet seal of the latter port, until the loan should be fully paid. Footnote: Edom, page 164. In 1380 Brember, Phillipott and Walworth were appointed. Footnote: 2 Riley Memorials, pages 305, 313, 345. Gregory's Chronicle, Camden SOC, page 88, on a commission to investigate the finances of the realm, together with the Archbishop of York, Earl of Arundel, etc. This group of men is, indeed, constantly mentioned together throughout such documents as the Patent Rolls, where matters of national finance are under consideration. Brember, Phillipott, and Walworth, or perhaps two of them, are sure to be mentioned. Footnote: It is noticeable that from 1377 on John of Northampton is never mentioned in the Patent Rolls in connection with financial operations, loans to the king, etc. In the latter part of his career complaints were sent to Parliament against him and Exton, by the mirrors, cordwainers, pounders, saddlers, painters, armorers, pinners, embroiderers, spurriers and blacksmiths, obviously the trades belonging to the then defunct party of John Northampton. Footnote: Rot. Parliament in 141 ff 225. He was accused in 1388 together with de la Pole, Robert Tresilian and other friends of the king of the following: having prevented access by others to the king, misled the king, caused the king to give manors, lands, and other offices to persons of their party and to persons from whom they received gifts or whom they wished to use, such as Usk, having caused the king to grant them money, etc. Footnote: Rot. Parliament 3, 230. As is well known, Brember was condemned and executed. At his death Brember left extensive estates, entered in the Inquisitions, in London and Kent. William de Walworth was born about 1320. He was apprenticed to John Lovekin, stockfishmonger, Mayor of London, 1348, 1358, 1365, 1366. Footnote: Woodcock, Lives of Lord Mayors, Surrey Archcall. 8, 277 ff. He was executor of Lovekin's will and seems to have retained a special feeling of loyalty for him, because in 1381 he founded a college of a master and 9 chaplains to celebrate divine service for the good estate of the king, himself, and Margaret his wife, for their souls after death, and for that of John Lovekin, formerly his master. Footnote: Cal. Pst. Roll, page 99. He was elected Mayor of London in 1374 and again in 1380. In 1370 he and Simon de Morden lent the king L300. On the day of Edward Ill's death he and John Phillipott went to the young king, implored his favour for the city of London, and asked him to put a stop to John of Gaunt's persecutions. When the Commons voted a subsidy to the king for carrying on the war, they expressed distrust of the management of it, and demanded that the funds be entrusted to Walworth and Phillipott, treasurers for the war. In 1381 Walworth accompanied the boy king at his meeting with the peasant leaders, and he, Brember and Phillipott were knighted by the king for their bravery on this occasion. He died in 1381. Walworth was appointed on many commissions of various sorts and dealt extensively in land. John Ward did not bulk so large in London affairs as did the others, and consequently I have been able to learn but little about him. He belonged to the Grocers' Company and consequently without doubt to Brember's faction. Footnote: Orage, Citizens of London. He had been sheriff in 1366 and was elected Mayor of London in 1375. Footnote: Call of London Cit., Camden SOC, pages 88-89. Robert Girdler is even more difficult to trace than Ward. He was Sheriff of London 1368-9. Footnote: Call of London Cit., Camden SOC, page 88. I have found reference to a transaction in which Robert Girdler agreed to buy certain cables and cords. Footnote: Cal of Letters, City of London, page 144. Consequently, he may not have been a dealer in provisions, and was perhaps a member of John Northampton's party. The last reference that I have found to him is the date of his collectorship, 1376. Richard Northberry was a leader of John Northampton's party. He was a member of the Mercers' Company. Footnote: Cal Rot. Pat. Tur. Lawn. Page 223. In 1384 he was found guilty with John of Northampton of sedition, and imprisoned. Certain tenements which he held in London were forfeited to the king. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 481. In 1385 the king granted him 10m. a year for clothing and 26m. a year for victuals, while he was a prisoner in Corfe Castle. Footnote: Edom, page 548. In 1391 the Commons petitioned the king to annul the decision against him and to restore him his lands, at the same time making similar petitions for John Northampton and John Moore. All three were granted. Footnote: Rot. Parliament, page 292. John Philippot is treated in D.N.B. He was apparently a ship owner, and certainly a member of the Grocers' Company. In 1363 he was appointed on a commission to seize forfeited goods for the king. In 1364 he was granted license to buy victuals and take them to Calais. In 1378 he was elected mayor. In 1379 Sir Roger Beauchamp, Lord Chamberlain to the king's household, bequeathed him my great cup gilt, which the King of Navarre gave me, and made him one of the executors of his will. In the same year he contributed largely to fitting out a fleet against the French, hiring a number of ships at his own expense, and redeeming 1,000 sets of armor and arms which had been pawned. In 1383 he was appointed on a commission to treat of peace with the Duke of Flanders. He died in 1384. John Ogston was alderman of London and sheriff in 1385. Footnote: Ol. Pat. Roll, page 90. I have not been able to discover what company he belonged to. In 1378 he was appointed one of the collectors of the tax of 2/15. Footnote: Reimer 4:34. In 1383 he was appointed one of the collectors of the subsidy of 2s. from each ton of wine and 6d. in the pound from the merchandise in the port of London. Footnote: Ol. Pat. Roll, page 128. From these appointments it seems likely that he was friendly to the Brember faction. Note also that he succeeded Philippot at the latter's death. John de Burghley. John de Burghley, with whom Chaucer in 1376 went on a diplomatic mission, was a brother of Simon de Burghley. Footnote: R. 242 mem 17. He was certainly attached personally to the Black Prince, for in 1378 Richard II confirmed to him a grant made by himself, when Prince, 51 edition 3, confirming a grant of his father the Prince of Wales, 41 edition 3, of L40 yearly for de Burghley's services, especially at the Battle of Nazar where he was the prince's bodyguard. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, p. 19/7. In 1373 he was appointed captain of Calais and commissioned to supervise the fortifications of Oderwick and other places besides Calais. Footnote: Reimer 3, 989-992. In 1375 he was on a commission to treat for peace with France. Footnote: Reimer 3, 1021. In 1377 he was a witness of Edward II's will. Footnote: Test. Vet. Page 11. And stepped out of the position of captain of Calais. Footnote: Reimer 4, 2. In 1377 he was granted the constableship of Nottingham Castle for life. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 34. He gave it up in 1381. Footnote: Edom, page 60. In 1378 Richard II confirmed to him a grant, 47/50 Edward III, of 40m. yearly in addition to the L40 already granted. Footnote: Edom, page 108. In 1378, L40 yearly were granted at his supplication, to his son W. de Burghley, Esquire, retained to stay with the king. Footnote: Edom, p. 283. In 1377 John de Burghley, Knight of the King's Chamber. Footnote: He was also so mentioned in 1370, was given the custody of Sherwood Forest. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 88. In 1378 he had the king change his grants of L40 and 40m to one of 100m, and give the latter to his son, John de Burghley, Kt. Footnote: Edom, page 281. In 1378 he was on a commission to treat for the marriage of Richard II with a daughter of the Duke of Milan. Footnote: Reimer Old Edition 7, 213. Later he was engaged in negotiations for Richard's marriage with Anne of Bohemia. While so employed, he and Michael de la Pole and Gerard del Au were taken prisoners and held for ransom. On this occasion the king sent money for the ransom of the three. Footnote: Devon's Issues 3, 224-5. On another occasion he was taken prisoner in Germany after having been sent as messenger to the King of Bohemia, and the king contributed 500m to his ransom. Footnote: Issue Roll Devon, 7 Rich. 2, page 225. In 1381 he gave up the custody of Sherwood Forest, and also that of Nottingham Castle. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, pages 54-60. In that year and the following he and Simon de Burghley are mentioned in connection with transfers of land. Footnote: Edom, page 160. In 1382 he was a justice of the peace in Hereford. In 1385 he was granted for life the custody of the alien priory of Watton-Waywyan, provided that its value should not exceed L45, 13ths. 4d. yearly, the rent which he was wont to pay for it. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll p. 45. I find no later mention of him, except the rather doubtful one of his inheriting land from Simon de Burghley, in 1388. Sir Edward de Berkeley. Sir Edward de Berkeley was a Knight of the Chamber to Richard II. Footnote: Reimer 4, 53. In 1376 he was appointed on a commission to treat for peace with France. Footnote: Edom 3, 1067-9. In 1378, Richard II confirmed a grant made by himself when Prince 50 Edward III, confirming letters patent of his father 45 Edward III, of £50 yearly. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 232. In 1378 he is mentioned as going on an expedition with John of Gaunt. Footnote: Reimer 4, 45, and is again appointed on a commission to treat for peace with Flanders. Footnote: Reimer 4, 53. He died for Richard II, leaving a manor and some lands in Suffolk. Footnote: Cal Inquiry P. M. 3, 28. His will, which is extant, footnote: Test Vet, page 113, directs that his body be buried in the church of St. Mary Carmelites in Calais, and bequeaths his dominion and monastery at Hickling to Sir John Clanbrowne, probably Sir John Clanval. Sir Thomas de Percy. Sir Thomas de Percy, with whom Chaucer was sent to Flanders in 1377, was brother of Henry de Percy, Count of Northumberland. Footnote: Reimer 4, 51. He was with the Black Prince at Bergerath, 44 Edward III. Footnote: Dugdale 1, 285. In 1378 a grant by Edward III to Thomas de Percy, whom the king has retained to stay with him, of 100m yearly was confirmed. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, .108. In that year and at many times subsequent he was Admiral of the North. Footnote: Edom, page 327. In 1378 he was appointed with others to treat with the King of Scotland. Footnote: Reimer 4, 51. In 1379 to treat with the Duke of Brittany. Footnote: Reimer Old Edition 7, 223. From 1381 on many pardons were granted at his request. In 1381 he was appointed custodian of the castle of Brest. In 1383 he was on a commission to treat with Flanders and France. Footnote: Edom 412. In 1386 he was sub-chamberlain in the king's household, literally, South Chamberlain. Footnote: Edom 675. By 1392 he was chamberlain of the household. Footnote: Edom 721. In 1398 he was made Earl of Worcester. Footnote: Dugdale I 285, and appointed with John of Gaunt on a commission for redressing violations of the truce. In 1399 he was appointed executor of the Duchess of Gloucester's will. He was beheaded in 1403 because of his connection with the Rising of Hotspur. He was a Knight of the Garter. Sir William de Beauchamp. That Sir William de Beauchamp was a friend to Chaucer has been recognized for some time. In May 1888, Mr. W. D. Selby called attention to this connection with Chaucer in a short article in the Athenaeum. In this article, Mr. Selby gave a few facts about him, gathered professedly from Dugdale, but omitted all mention of the curious connection Sir William de Beauchamp had with the property of the Earl of Pembroke, for his custodianship of which Chaucer was one of the sureties. William de Beauchamp was a younger son of Thomas, Earl of Warwick. Footnote: Cf. Dugdale's Baronage I, 238 ff. Dugdale Antiquities of Warwickshire 2, 1029 ff. In 40 Edward III he attended John of Gaunt in his expedition into Spain. In 44 Edward III he served as a knight in France, in the retinue of John of Gaunt, and again in 47 Edward III. In 47 Edward III de Beauchamp signed an indenture to serve John of Gaunt in peace and in war during his life in consideration of 100 marks yearly and wages for 6 horses and 4 boys. Footnote: Register of John, Duke of Lancaster, Volume 13. Miscellaneous Books Rec. Off. He had been connected with John of Gaunt's household even earlier, in 1340 and 1346. Footnote: Same book. In 1 Richard II he served with Edmund de Langley, Earl of Cambridge, in Spain with 200 men-at-arms and 200 archers, and in the King's Navy at sea under John of Gaunt. In 13 Richard II he served again in France. In 1377 he was granted for life the custody of Feckenham Forest and Park at a farm of L 37/14. 4-1 divided by 2d. From the beginning of his reign, Richard II granted many pardons at the supplication of William de Beauchamp. In 1379 he was chamberlain of the king's household. In 1380 he was granted an annuity of 200 m. Footnote: Not L200 as Mr. Selby says. See Pat. Roll 1380, pages 561, 600. He was regularly on commissions of the peace in Warwick, in company with his brother, the Earl of Warwick. In 1379 he and Louis de Clifford aided Robert de Ferrers in acquiring the manor of Wem in fee. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll p. 332. In 1383 he was appointed on a commission to treat with Flanders. In 1384 he was appointed Captain of Calais, a position he held until 1392. To return now to one matter in which Chaucer is closely connected with William de Beauchamp. In 1378 the king granted William de Beauchamp the custody of the castle and estates of Pembroke, in his hands by reason of the minority of the Earl of Pembroke. The father of the last Earl of Pembroke, John de Hastings, had, by license from the crown, settled all his possessions, in the event of failure of his own issue, except the castle and town of Pembroke, upon his cousin William de Beauchamp, his mother's sister's son. Footnote: Surrey Archcall. XVH 2930. These lands were in the hands of the king in 1378 because John de Hastings had died and his son was still a minor. Naturally, he appointed the next heir custodian of them. But William de Beauchamp's management of the estates was certainly not satisfactory, and, if the suretyship of Chaucer was anything but a form, the poet stood a good chance of losing by it. The first notice we find of Beauchamp's unsatisfactory management is in 1386, when a commission was appointed to inquire touching the waste in the possessions of John de Hastings by William de Beauchamp, to whom the king had committed the custody of the land. In the same year we find record of an indenture made between Margaret Mareschal, Countess of Norfolk, guardian of John de Hastings, and the said John, on the one side, and William de Beauchamp on the other, whereby the latter agreed to surrender his custody of the estates, and the former in return to free him of liability for the waste. Footnote: Cal Pat. Roll, page 257. In 1389 the king appointed a commission to inquire touching the waste in the lands of the alien priory of Kirkby Monacorum, County Warwick, in the time of William de Beauchamp, knight, farmer thereof. Footnote: Edom, page 350. Idem, page 208. In 1390 we find a revocation for reasons declared before the king and council in the present parliament, with the assent of the nobles, magnates, etc., of recent letters granting during pleasure to William de Beauchamp the custody of the lands, tenements, etc. of John de Hastings. Footnote: whether these were part of the Pembroke holdings or not, I do not know. In the same year the custody was regranted to John Gallafra, Knight of the King's Chamber, at a farm of L 600, Beauchamp had paid L 500. Footnote: Gall. Pat. Roll, page 180. In 1390, however, the young Earl of Pembroke was killed in a tournament, and according to the provisions made by his father, the estates devolved upon William de Beauchamp. Other heirs contested his rights to them, but he won. A curious story told about his claim is as follows. Beauchamp invited his learned counsel to his house in Paternoster Row in the city of London, amongst whom were Robert Charlton, then a judge, William Pinchbeck, William Brent Chesley, and John Catesby, all learned lawyers, and after dinner, coming out of his chapel in an angry mood, threw to each of them a piece of gold and said, "Sirs, I desire you forthwith to tell me whether I have any right and title to Hastings' lordships and lands." Whereupon Pinchbeck stood up, the rest being silent, fearing that he suspected them, and said, "No man here, nor in England, dares say that you have any right in them, except Hastings." Footnote: evidently Edward Hastings, a contesting heir. Quit his claim therein, and should he do it being now under age, it would be of no validity. Dugdale. In 1387, footnote, according to Belts, page 229, when Richard II was preparing for his assault upon the Gloucester faction with which William de Beauchamp was evidently, as his brother the Earl of Warwick was certainly, connected, he tried to remove Beauchamp from the office of Captain of Calais, by messenger. Beauchamp refused to leave the office, saying that he received that charge and trust publicly from the king, in the presence of his nobles, and therefore would not quit it in a private manner. Dugdale. When his successor arrived, Beauchamp arrested him, and took him to England. There Beauchamp himself was arrested but was soon released. In 1393 he was summoned to Parliament as Baron Bergavany, a title received in connection with the Pembroke estates. From 1390 to 96 I find reference to grants of land made by him to religious bodies. He seems to have been rather in disfavor in these closing years of Richard I's reign, but under Henry IV he received new grants, of the manor of Feckenham, rent-free, and of the custody of the castle and county of Pembroke. He died 12 Henry IV and was buried in Blackfriars, Hereford. He married Joan, second sister and co-heir of Thomas Fitz-Alan, Earl of Arundel. He was a Knight of the Garter. Dugdale prints, in his Warwickshire, the wills of William de Beauchamp and his wife, remarkable medieval documents. Richard Forester. The name of Richard Forester is connected with Chaucer's first in 1378, when Chaucer, about to go abroad on a mission for the king, had letters of attorney under the names of John Cower and Richard Forester. Footnote: Life Records, No. 120, page 216, and again in 1386. When a lease for the house over Aldgate which Chaucer had occupied during his years as Controller of the Customs in London was made out by the Mayor and Aldermen to Richard Forester, citizen of London. Footnote: Life Records, No. 192, page 264. Various entries with regard to Richard Forester occur in the public records. Whether all of them refer to one man or not, and whether any concerns Chaucer's friend, I cannot say. I shall merely present them in order of their occurrence. In 37 Edward III Richard Forester was appointed custodian and supervisor of the river bank called La Rue de Edamore. Footnote: Pat. Roll 267, mem. 6. In 1369 he is on the list of esquires of less degree. Footnote: L. R. Page 174. In 1370 £10 were paid out of the exchequer to Richard Forester, of Stanton, who had been sent with 6 archers to Shropshire to carry a certain sum of money from thence to London. Footnote: Devon's Issues, page 170. Later in the same year he received £91, 2 shillings, 7 pence halfpenny for the expenses of himself, his men-at-arms and archers in the war. Footnote: Edom, page 461. In 44 Edward III our beloved armiger Richard Forester of Stanton was granted custody of the manor of Stokelady in Hereford which had belonged to Richard Risholme, deceased. Footnote: Pat. Roll 281 mem. 36. In 47 Edward III, Richard Law Forester de Beckel had a grant of £10 and 1 robe per annum as a valetus of the royal chamber. Footnote Pat. Roll 289 mem. 21. In 50 Edward III, Richard Forester was granted custody of the manor of Waterpyry and 1 Meswich in Thomley in Oxfordshire, and the manor of Wormenhale in Buckinghamshire, during the minority of the heir. Footnote. Item 293 mem. 8. In 1378 Richard II confirmed to Richard Le Forester of Beckel, whom the king has retained to stay with him, his annuity of £10. Footnote. Cal Pat. Roll, page 126. In 5 Richard II the king granted to Richard Forester and his son Lambert custody of the royal manor of Beckel with the hamlet of Horton for 10 years at a rent of 50 marks per annum. Footnote. Fine Roll 184 mem. 14. In 7 Richard II Forester is referred to as an inhabitant of Oxfordshire. Footnote. Edom 187 mem. 25. In 12 Richard II Richard Forester of Stanton paid 2 marks for a confirmation of a grant of Edward III of certain lands in Oxfordshire. Footnote. Edom 192 mem. 3. In 16 Richard II Richard Forester, citizen of London, with a group of London mercers acquired some land. Footnote. C. R. 234 mem. 20 Dorm. Again in 21 Richard II he acquired more land, but later assigned it to his associates. Footnote. C. R. 241 mem. 14 Dorm mem. 12 Dorm. Henry Scogan. With regard to Henry Scogan I have but few facts which do not appear in Professor Kittredge's article. Footnote. Harvard Studies and Notes I. In 9 and 10 Richard II he was a valetus of Simon de Burleigh's. Many entries in the issue roll of those years indicate that he was employed to carry money from the Exchequer to de Burleigh, and to arrange for the fortification of Dover. Footnote. Issues, page 313, mem. 12, 13, 19, 21, 2 entries, page 314, mem. 1, 4, 7, 12, 13, page 315, mem. 15, 18, page 316, mem. 1, 2, 16. In 15 Richard II £10 were given to Henry Scogan, Scutifer, at Nottingham. Footnote. Issues, page 325, mem. 8. In 20 Richard II Henry Sugan of Rainham granted to Thomas Wary and others 3 pieces of land in Toasts, for which they were to pay him a penny yearly. Footnote. C. R. 238 mem. 32 Dorso. In the same year he and John Hollock, Chevalier, went on a bond for Henry Reshefford, under penalty of £200 each, that the latter should do no harm to the Gedneys. Footnote. C. R. 238 mem. 12 Dorm. In 21 Richard II he conveyed 100 shillings from the Exchequer into the King's Chamber. Footnote. Issues, page 343 mem. 12. An action which suggests that he was probably connected with the King's Court at this time. Otto de Grounson. The only important fact which I have found with regard to de Grounson, aside from those mentioned in Romania 19, is an indenture made apparently in 48 Edward III, between Otz de Grandson Chevalier and John of Lancaster. Footnote. Duchy of Lancaster Registers, No. 13F, 134 Dorm. On de Grounson, see note in Earl of Derby's Expeditions, Camden SOC, page 309. According to this document, de Grandson agrees to serve the Duke in time of peace as well as of war in return for a fee of 100 marks a year. Buckton. Skeat has supposed the Buckton mentioned in Chaucer's L'Envoi à Buckton to be Sir Peter Buckton of York. There is, however, at least one other possibility. A Robert de Buckton is mentioned in 3 Richard II as armiger to Thomas de Percy. Footnote. Issues, page 301, mem. 21. With whom it will be remembered Chaucer had some 3 years before been associated in a diplomatic mission. In 14, 15 and 16 Richard II, Robert de Buckton, Scutifer of Thomas de Percy, is frequently mentioned in the issue roll as transmitting money from the Exchequer to de Percy. Footnote. Page 323, mem. 11. Page 324, mem. 1 12 21, page 327 mem. 17, page 328 mem. 16, page 330 mem. 1 22, and in one case to Lewis Clifford. Footnote, page 323 mem. 8. In 15 Richard II, the king inspected and confirmed a patent of Queen and dated 15 Richard II, being a grant for the term of her life to her esquire Robert Buckton, of a quantity of pasture and wood called Goswold, in her lordship of I. by the yearly service of the rent of a rose. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll, page 324. In 1399 this was confirmed. Footnote, Edom 1399, page 16. And in 1401 Robert de Buckton is mentioned as constable of the castle of I. Footnote, Edom 1401, page 540. Robert de Buckton was returned to Parliament from the county of Suffolk in 17 Richard II, 1393 to 4, 20 Richard II, 1396 to 7, 21 Richard II, 1397, 1397 to 8, and 2 Henry IV, 1400 to 1. On account of his constant connection with the court, Robert de Buckton would seem more probably to have been Chaucer's Buckton than Skeat's candidate. Footnote, on Sir Peter Buckton, see note in Scrope Grosvenor Roll, 2, 466 to 7, containing many facts not in Skeat. Chaucer's career and his relation to John of Gaunt. What then is the bearing of all this upon Chaucer's career? Let us take up the matter point by point. In the first place, it is clear that although in a few cases the esquires were connected with important families, in none did any come from a major branch of an important family, and in most the derivation is from ordinary stock. Chaucer was then associated with a group of men who came from much the same class as himself. Footnote, cf. pages 6 to 11 above. Secondly, it appears that the esquires were frequently the sons of men connected in some way with the court. Footnote, page 12. In this respect also Chaucer was like his associates, for his father, in 1338 at least, was in the king's service. Footnote, L. R. number 13, page 145 intro. Page 11. Further, many of the esquires had served in the household of one of the king's children before becoming members of the king's household. In this respect also Chaucer with his service in the Duke of Clarence's house was like a number of his fellows. The exact nature of Chaucer's position in the household it is difficult to discover. Dr. Furnivall supposed from an entry of May 25, 1368, the second half-yearly payment of Chaucer's annuity, that he was first a valettus of the king's chamber. Footnote, L. R. number 50, page 161. But it is by no means certain that this is correct. Chaucer is called valettus of the king's chamber only once. In all other early references he is described, if at all, as Valectus Hospitii Regis. There is, I believe, a difference between these two. As I have already pointed out, footnote, page 17 above, a certain confusion with regard to the use of such phrases undoubtedly exists in the records. As evidence of this confusion we find men called valettus after they have been called armiger, and sometimes men who are normally called valettus camera regis, named as valettus hospitii regis. Yet if we look up the entries with regard to the men called valets de la chambre du roi in the list of 1368, footnote L. R. page 167. In many cases, of course, they are called merely valettus noster, diletus valettus, or diletus servitor. We find that in such records as the patent rolls were definitely characterized, they are generally referred to as valettus camera nostrae. For example, William Gambon is so titled 7 times and never as valettus hospitii nostrae. Footnote Pat. Roll 285, mem. 2, Edom 274, mem. 37, 257, mem. 25, Cal Pat. Roll 1377, page 79, issues, page 228, mem. 17, C. R. 207, mem. 12, Pat. Roll 295, mem. 26. Reginald Newport is called 6 times. Valetus Camera Regis. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 139, issues, page 237, MEM. 17, page 249, MEM. 3, page 251, MEM. Pat. Roll 288, MEM. 21, etc. John Tippett is called the same at least 5 times, and never by any other title. Footnote, issues of 169, MEM. 35, page 228, MEM. 17, page 228, MEM. 38, page 235, MEM. 20, etc. Thomas Shane is called Valetus Camera Regis 5 times. Footnote Pat. Roll 262, MEM. 23, 254, MEM. 4, 255, MEM. 25, Cal Rot. Pat. Tur. Lon. Page 174, abbreviation Rot. Originally 222. Thomas Loved and alone is called Valetus Hospitii Regis twice and Valetus Camera once. Footnote, issues, page 287, MEM. 8, page 250, MEM. 1, Pat. Roll 266, MEM. 5. Under the circumstances, if Chaucer ever was a Valetus Camera Regis, we should expect him to have been so called more than once. It seems rather more likely that his proper position was that of Valetus Hospitii Regis. Footnote, the household books, published in the Chaucer records, recognize no such classification as Valetus Hospitii Regis. The records certainly point to the existence of such a classification, and later, of course, Armiger, or Scutifer. This view is, of course, supported by the fact that in the household list his name does not appear in 1368 as a valet de la chambre du roi, or in 1369, even near the names of men who had been valeti of the king's chamber. Further, that Chaucer's position by 1363 was distinctly honorable appears from the fact that his name appears as esquire among a group of men who were not engaged in menial occupations of any kind, as distinguished from the cooks and farriers of the groups called esquires servants, and sergeants de offices parvents furs a chaperon. With regard to Chaucer's employment as an envoy abroad, it is clear that he was, when so engaged, performing a customary service, that indeed he was one of several who were constantly used in minor missions abroad, and that his rank and duties were similar to those of a king's messenger today. Footnote, cf. pages 19, 20 above. Likewise, the rewards which Chaucer received were not extraordinary. Practically every esquire of Chaucer's rank who remained for any considerable time in the court received an annuity. Evidently such pensions were part of the perquisites of the office. A few esquires received a smaller annuity than Chaucer's, many received about the same amount, and many received more. Footnote, cf. page 21 ff. Similarly, the special offices which Chaucer held, particularly his controllerships, were not evidences of remarkable favor. Other esquires received the same kind of offices, and indeed they were apparently regular sinecures for the members of the king's household. Footnote, cf. page 22 ff. So also the grant of wardships and forfeited goods can be paralleled in many cases. In 2 respects Chaucer received rather less than the other esquires. He was given no corrodi and no grant of land. In one more respect can Chaucer's career be paralleled by that of other esquires, in that of his marriage. Marriages between the esquires of the king and the damsels of the queen were decidedly frequent. Footnote, cf. page 25 ff. Indeed, it is clear from the study of the careers of the other esquires that, so far as we know, Chaucer received no exceptional favors, and that his career was in practically every respect a typical esquire's career. In all this, then, there is no evidence that Chaucer enjoyed the favor of any particular patron. Aside from the fact that, like Chaucer, some of the esquires had served in the household of one of the king's children before entering the king's, I have been able in no case to find evidence of connection between them and any patron. Since Chaucer received no more favors than did the average esquire, there is no particular reason to suppose that he had any patron. Now let us examine the evidence in favor of his close connection with John of Gaunt. We have two pieces of definite evidence of a connection between Chaucer and John of Gaunt. Chaucer's writing, probably shortly after 1369, of the Book of the Duchess, and John of Gaunt's grant of an annuity of £10 in June 1374. The former does not prove anything with regard to a definite relation. Such complimentary poems were commonly written for nobles who were not special patrons of the poets, and Chaucer in his Parliament of Fools possibly complimented Richard II in much the same way. In regard to the latter piece of evidence, John of Gaunt's grant of an annuity, two things are to be noted: first, that John of Gaunt had previously given an annuity to Philippa Chaucer in 1372, and second, that in the grant he gives the cause of making it to Chaucer as services rendered by Chaucer to the Duke and by Chaucer's wife to Queen Philippa and the Duke's consort. In the grant to Philippa, on the other hand, no mention is made of Geoffrey. This greater particularity in the statement of Philippa's services in Geoffrey's grant, the fact that Philippa was in the Duke's household, evidenced by the Christmas gifts of silver cups to her, and the fact that nothing else connects Chaucer definitely with John of Gaunt, make it seem almost certain that the grant of an annuity to Chaucer was made merely in order to increase the sum given to Philippa. Grants of this time which mention the services of both husband and wife are usually made out to both, and undoubtedly in this case the real purpose was to give it to Philippa and her husband. On the other hand, if John of Gaunt really was Chaucer's great patron, why did he not give the poet employment in his own household? Anyone who will run through the Lancashire registers of this time will be struck with the immensity of the Duke's income and the regal scale of his household. Footnote: Cf. Abstracts and Indexes IF, 13 feet 7 inches dorso. Warrant to deliver to a damsel for the Queen, i.e. John of Gaunt's Spanish wife, 1708 pearls of the largest, 2,000 of the second sort. Warrant to bring him at the Savoy all the rolls of accounts of all his receivers general and of his treasurers of war and of the household, and other officers of the household, there to be deposited and safely kept. Next page, long list of jewels. Surely had he wished to patronize the poet, he could have done so most easily and most surely by giving him some honorable post in his own control. Why should he have taken the difficult method of procuring him precarious offices under the king? Since the assertions with regard to John of Gaunt's ascendancy over Chaucer's career have been so common, however, we ought to take up the matter point by point. We have no reason to connect John of Gaunt with Chaucer's start in the world, his employment in the household of the Countess of Clarence. We know that Chaucer's father had relations with the court, and, although merely a merchant, he may very likely have secured Chaucer's appointment to the place in the Countess's household, as the fathers of Simon de Burley, not a merchant, but a man of no rank, Michael de la Pole, a merchant, John Legge, Thomas Frowick and Thomas Hawtine obtained appointments for their children in the households of the Prince of Wales and of the King. This was an age when the merchant class was obtaining unusual power and privileges. Richard II, it will be remembered, was called the Londoners' King. It has been shown that John of Gaunt visited the Countess of Clarence at Christmas 1357, and it has been suggested that he may have met Chaucer then and taken a liking to him. Of actual meeting, however, we have no proof. Chaucer was in the service of the Duke of Clarence in October 1860. Footnote: see Modern Lang. Notes: March 1912 article of Dr. Samuel Moore on the new Chaucer item. The Duchess of Clarence died in 1363, and we learn of him next in the King's household in 1367. The transition from the household of the wife of one of the King's sons to that of the King himself is one which can be paralleled in many cases. We have no need to suppose patronage on the part of the Duke of Lancaster to account for it. As a matter of fact, we have no reason to suppose that John of Gaunt knew anything of Chaucer at this time. The diplomatic missions, and the grants of annuities and offices were not, as I have shown, evidences of special favor. They were a regular thing in the King's court. We have no reason to suppose that John of Gaunt's influence in favor of Chaucer was a cause for any of them. Further, John of Gaunt's influence would have been worthless in helping Chaucer to become Justice of the Peace in Kent in 1385. This appointment must have been made by the Chancellor, Michael de la Pole, possibly at the recommendation of the Lord Lieutenant of the county, or the Custos Rotulorum. Whether there was a Lord Lieutenant of Kent or not, I do not know. At any rate, the Constable of Dover Castle and Warden of the Cinque Ports, at this time Simon de Burley, held powers in Kent similar to those of a Lord Lieutenant, and he occupies the position of the Lord Lieutenant in the list of Justices of the Peace, at the top. Both de la Pole and de Burley were enemies of John of Gaunt. Even if the appointment was not due to them, we cannot ascribe it to John of Gaunt, for I have been able to find no evidence that John of Gaunt had influence in Kent, or that he controlled any of the other justices. Furthermore, that Chaucer did not owe his place in the customs to the influence of John of Gaunt is clear from the fact that the collectorships of customs in London, at any rate, were controlled by the Duke's enemies. If they had sufficient power with the king to gain control of those offices, it hardly seems likely that the king would appoint a member of the faction opposed to them to serve with them. It is to be noted also that Chaucer, on account of the business connections of his family, his father was a vintner, and another relative, evidently a pepperer, would be more likely to sympathize with the party of Brember than with that of Northampton. Now we come to a point where nearly all writers on Chaucer make inferences in regard to John of Gaunt's influence: Chaucer's separation from the office of Controller of the Customs. Most writers have said more or less directly that Chaucer lost the office because John of Gaunt had left England earlier in the same year. The facts themselves show indubitably that Chaucer's leaving office was in no respect due to John of Gaunt's departure. Before discussing this matter, I must say a word about the political situation before 1386 and in that year. At the very end of Edward II's reign, John of Gaunt, who had been the real power since the death of the Black Prince, became extremely unpopular because of his bad administration of the government and his quarrels with the condoners. This unpopularity continued both in the court and without. Under the new king, the great duke had little influence. He was not even included in the great council appointed to control the government during the king's minority. Further, a group of young men, connected with the king, gradually assumed charge of affairs: Michael de la Pole, Robert de Vere, and others. These men were outright enemies of John of Gaunt. According to the stories of the time, they even made plots to poison and to stab him. He himself retired from active political life and apparently, largely because he saw no chance for gaining great power in England, turned his attention to his Spanish projects. Footnote: Trevelyan's view. And in 1386 he left England for Spain. Others of the great lords, however, were not content to play a passive role. The brother of John of Gaunt, Gloucester, as leader, and the Earl of Arundel and Warwick, most prominent followers, were particularly violent in their attacks on the king and his friends. To revert now to Chaucer's case, these are the significant facts in their order. End of March, 1386, footnote, or July 7th according to Oman, John of Gaunt leaves England. October 24, 1386, Gloucester, Arundel et al. Succeed in ousting Michael de la Pole and the king's other cabinet officers. December 1386, Adam Yardley and Henry Geysers are appointed to Chaucer's places in the customs. These dates speak for themselves. They show indubitably that Chaucer was not removed from office shortly after John of Gaunt's departure, that he was not removed from office, if at all, until the friends of John of Gaunt, the men who represented his interests. Footnote: in the following year his son and heir, the Earl of Derby, was one of the Lord Appellants, had in some measure at least gained the government of the kingdom. A similar condition of affairs appears when Chaucer was appointed to his next office in 1389. May 1389, the king regained power, dismissed Gloucester's friends from office, and appointed his own. July 12, 1389, he made Chaucer clerk of his works at Westminster. August 1389, he seems to have asked John of Gaunt to return to England. November 1389, John of Gaunt actually returned. Richard II then appointed Chaucer to that place a little over a month after he had regained his authority, and 4 months before John of Gaunt appeared in England. Finally, we cannot connect John of Gaunt in any way with Chaucer's departure from the office of Clerk of the Works in June 1391. From John of Gaunt's return to England in 1389 until 1395 he seems to have been influential with the king. In 1390 he was made Duke of Aquitaine for life. In 1392 he was ambassador to France, in 1393 he aided in putting down a revolt in Chester. He was in England, apparently, most of this time. Certainly the analysis of Chaucer's life does not confirm the theory that John of Gaunt exercised a ruling influence over his destiny. Nor does a study of the connections of his associates indicate his dependency on John of Gaunt. His friend William de Beauchamp was at a later date certainly a member of the Gloucester, Warwick faction. But in 1378 and 1380, when Chaucer was apparently connected with him, Beauchamp was a member of the king's household, from 1379 on chamberlain of the household, evidently in favor with the king and not a partisan of the Lancaster-Gloucester faction. Further, we know that Chaucer associated in a business way at least with Brember, Philipot and Walworth, that he probably knew Thomas Uske, that the latter admired him, and that in the king's household he was connected with some men like John de Beauchamp and John de Salisbury who were not friends to John of Gaunt. Yet toward the end of Richard II's reign we find Chaucer connected in some way with John of Gaunt's son, and when a few years later that son ascended the throne as Henry IV, Chaucer received new annuities and aids. The fact then that Chaucer was friendly with prominent men in both factions makes it incredible that his fortunes were dependent on those of John of Gaunt. One other suggestion was John of Gaunt likely to have had enough interest in poetry to patronize a poet? I have found no evidence that he did patronize other poets or artists of any kind, and the impression of his character which a careful scholar like Mr. Trevelyan has gained from a study of his career is not that he was such a man as would be interested in the arts. From all these facts, I do not see how it can be maintained that John of Gaunt was Chaucer's great patron. The evidence, so far as I can make out at present, leads one to the conclusion that Chaucer must have received his offices and royal annuities from the king rather than from John of Gaunt, at times when John of Gaunt's influence would have been harmful rather than beneficial, or when John of Gaunt was not in England to exercise it. Chaucer's relation to Richard II. Certain recent investigations have suggested that Richard II and his consort and may have been patrons of Chaucer. For this theory the most definite evidence is derived from references to Queen Anne in several of the poems. The most obvious of these references is that in Prologue to L. G. W. version F. 11. 496-7. Another is the one implied in Coke's explanation for the writing of P. F. And Professor Lowes finds two more in his interpretations of a line in K. T. M. L. N. 19. 240.242, and of one in the Troilus. 2 P. M. L. A. 32. 285 ff. Since this investigation has to do wholly with external evidences as to Chaucer's life, it is not my business to deal with these references. I would merely point out that they can derive no active support from the facts which we know about Chaucer's life, for there is no exceptional feature of his career as an esquire which points toward patronage by anyone. We have no right from the circumstances of his rewards and appointments to suppose that Richard even knew that he was a poet, certainly none to suppose that Richard enjoyed his poetry and patronized him because of it. To be sure, we have certain evidences of Richard II's interest in literature, especially the well-known stories of his suggestion to Gower that the poet write the Confessio Amantis, his gift to Froissart for the latter's book of poems, and the payment entered in 1380 on the issue roll of £28 for the Bible written in French. Footnote: Devon's translation, page 213, is incorrect. The phrase in the document is Lingua Gallica. Issues page 301, MEM. 16. The Romance of the Rose and the Romances of Perceval and Gawain. But those are all. A careful reading of the issue roll for all the years of Richard's reign has failed to turn up another entry which would indicate an interest in literature. It is to be noted further that in the entire body of poems left to us by Chaucer, but a few unmistakable references to the Queen occur, and none to the King. If Chaucer is compared in this respect with his successors Hoccleve and Lydgate, a marked difference appears. In a single volume of Hoccleve before me, footnote, Hoccleve's works i.e. E.T.S. 1892, occur 3 ballades to Henry v., 1 to the Duke of York, 1 to the Duke of Bedford, and 1 to the Lord Chancellor. Perhaps the striking contrast between this and Chaucer's practice is due to different notions as to the function of poetry, perhaps to some other cause, but it exists, and it causes one to feel that, In comparison with Hawkleave at least, the internal evidences of patronage in Chaucer's poems are slight indeed. Finally, the fact that Chaucer was treated favorably by the government of Henry IV would suggest that his personal relations with Richard II had not been very close. Some general points. Although I have objected to some of the inferences drawn by others, nevertheless it seems to me that from the facts viewed in their new relations, some legitimate inferences may be drawn. In the first place, it seems almost certain that by 1386 Chaucer held considerable land in Kent. Every other man on the list of justices of the peace, with the single possible exception of Topcliffe, held fairly extensive lands in the county. All except de Burghley, Topcliffe, and Chaucer were of old Kentish families. De Burghley's importance as Constable of Dover, indeed he undoubtedly held the office of Justice ex officio, and Topcliffe's position as steward of the Archbishop of Canterbury counterbalanced the fact that they were not of Kentish stock. What then of Chaucer? He surely must have held a manor and lands of considerable value, or he could never have been high enough in the estimation of the landed proprietors to gain the justiceship and even the membership to Parliament. Now, he apparently did not receive this land by royal grant. Consequently, it would appear that he must have had it by grant of some great noble, or by purchase. In any case, we have no record to indicate what land he held or by what tenure he held it. Again, we do not know what Chaucer's income as Controller of the Customs amounted to. It is apparent, however, that the returns from the office of Controller of the Greater Custom must have been very considerable. If the Collectorship of the Customs was not a profitable office, it is impossible to see why such men as Walworth, Phillpot, and Brember should have cared to hold it. That the £20 which was their nominal salary was anything like all that they received is unbelievable. To suppose that a man who could fit out a fleet at his own expense and successfully campaign with it against a powerful pirate should allow himself to be annoyed by so paltry an office is absurd. Yet the office was apparently not farmed, and so it seems likely that the income from fees was large and attractive. Footnote: The View of W. D. Chester, Chronicles of the Customs Department, page 30. To how great an extent Chaucer, aside from the £10 yearly that he received, shared in the profits, we do not know. From the fact that the king in giving the collectors and the controller extra rewards seems to have rated the latter at about a third of the importance of the former, we might get some hint of the proportion in which he would share in the fees. Chaucerian scholars have laid great stress upon the grant of permission to Chaucer in 1385 to appoint a permanent deputy in his office in the Greater Customs. They have even assumed that the L.G.W. was dedicated to the Queen out of gratitude for her supposed intercession with the king, and the consequent permission, and have used these suppositions as evidence for dating L.G.W. Surely too much has been made of this matter. Not only have we no evidence whatever to connect Queen and with the granting of the deputyship, we do not have to assume any intercession with the king. Footnote: See forthcoming article, Chaucer and the Earl of Oxford, in Modern Philology. We know that esquires who were granted offices in the customs frequently did have deputies in their offices. Footnote: Of cases of John de Hurling, Helming Legate, John Hermes Thorpe et al., probably leave to have a deputy could be had almost for the asking. Moreover, the office of controller, if we can judge from the records of Chaucer's time, cf. Mr. Kirk's print in the Chaucer Society, not yet issued, could not have been a very burdensome one. Yet even the provision that Chaucer write the records with his own hand was not, in the opinion of the officials of the Record Office, held to even as early as 1381. The reason for this judgment is that the preserved records are written in a decidedly good chancery hand, a style of writing which only a professional chancery clerk is supposed to have been master of. Footnote: See Tales of the Canterbury Pilgrims, Stokes and Company, Intro, by Furnivall, P. X. Note. Consequently, either Chaucer must have been a regular chancery clerk, or he employed a clerk to write up the records. If he did the latter, as seems most likely, it is hard to see what work of importance can have been left to himself. Why then should he care for a permanent deputy? If we look at the circumstances of his life in 1385, we may discover a possible reason. In that year, he first appears prominently in connection with Kent. The sequence of events is: February 1385, Deputy appointed. October, 1385 Justice of the Peace in Kent. June, 1386, Justice of the Peace in Kent. August, 1386, Member of Parliament for Kent. He must have been out of London at latest sometime early in 1385, and he may have been occupied with the purchase and management of whatever land he possessed in Kent, and with the politics of that county. Consequently, he may have desired to have a recognized deputy in the office who would relieve him of all official responsibility. One can see no reason why he should have felt particularly grateful for the grant of this merely technical freedom. Furthermore, we can have no knowledge, with our present information alone, of why Chaucer ceased to be controller at the end of 1386. I have already shown that this could not have been due to John of Gaunt's absence from England. It is almost equally certain that it was not due to the fact that Chaucer was a partisan of the king, or that the Council of 13 was instructed to inquire into the conduct of the king's offices and to initiate reforms. Footnote: as Colton in his book on Chaucer's England assumes, pages 58 to 59, the proof of those statements is this: so far as we know, Chaucer's only fault in the conduct of these offices was the fact that he performed them by deputy. Now, although the two offices were granted in December to Adam Yardley, footnote: Adam Yardan clericus, was in 1383 joined with a sergeant at arms to take and arrest mariners for the passage of the Bishop of Norwich across the Channel. This would suggest that he was connected in some way with the court, since such duties were commonly assigned to esquires and clerks of the court. And Henry Gisors, footnote: Henry Guises seems to have come from an eminent London family. Riley Memorials, pages 74, 185. Ancient Deeds, a 7833. Maitland History of London, page 825. In 11 Richard II and 16 Richard II he was concerned with John Hermes Thorpe in certain transfers of land in London. Ancient Deeds, B 2118, 2121. The controllership of the Greater Custom was regranted scarcely 6 months later to John Hermes Thorpe. Footnote: John Hermes Thorpe was a very much more important person. He was for some years one of the chamberlains of the King's Exchequer, probably as early as 1370, when on one day he conveyed payments of their annuities to Philippa Chaucer and 3 other damsels of the Queen. He was likewise Ft. priest, for a time confessor to the King, and holder of various ecclesiastical preferments, in London and elsewhere. He was in particular master of the hospital of St. Catherine from 1368 till a few years before his death in 1412. The fact that he was in favor with the king and that he was allowed to exercise the office by deputy makes untenable the supposition that Chaucer was dismissed because he was a friend to the king, or because he did not actually conduct the office himself. Devon's Issues, page 359, Calpat. Roll 1379, page 386. Full statement of ecclesiastical offices in Bibliotheca Topographies Britannica 2, 82. July 2, 1387, and with that very grant he was empowered to exercise the office by deputy. Furthermore, Henry Gisors, who succeeded Chaucer in the controllership of the petty customs, was appointed by Chaucer as his deputy, in 7 Richard II, footnote, c. R. 224 mem. 36, Calpat. Roll, page 502, in that office. This office was regranted September 2, 1388 to Robert Kesteven. Now, in the case of the controllership of the Greater Customs, it seems evident that Adam Yardley was merely put into the office as a stopgap. Note that he was not considered of sufficient importance to be given another grant in 1387 to compensate him for the loss of the office. And similarly in that of the Lesser Customs, it seems clear that Guises, Chaucer's deputy in the office, was appointed temporarily to the office, on the departure of Chaucer, and deprived of it again as soon as the king found someone to whom he wished to give a sinecure. Surely, if one may be allowed to draw inferences from facts, it seems most likely that Chaucer resigned the offices either to take up some work not now known to us, or to have leisure after more than 10 years' occupation in office and missions, and that on his resignation the king made merely temporary appointments, and later filled the offices according to his pleasure. The theory that Chaucer's surrender of his annuity indicates any extraordinary condition or disfavor on the part of his patrons is likewise not supported by the facts. In the introduction to the Chaucer records, Mr. Kirk writes, "It may be asserted without fear of contradiction that it was a most unusual thing for any man to surrender a pension, and for the king to grant it to someone else. Lands and tenements, or offices, were frequently surrendered in this way, but not pensions." Footnote, page 36. Surely Mr. Kirk's statement is too strong, for it is easy to find plenty of examples of transfers of annuity quite analogous to Chaucer's. For example, in 38 Edward III a grant of 10 marks yearly to John Gatinees was, with his consent, taken from him and given to Thomas de Fisherbourne. Footnote Pat. Roll 269 mem. 12. Later an annuity held by John de Stone, a valet, was transferred by his request to Peter de Bruges. Footnote, Edom 273 mem. 10. Other examples are a transfer of an annuity from Hugh Farrer to John Spencer at the request of the former. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, page 248. From T. de Laleham to John Stapenhall, at request of the former. Footnote, Edom, page 150. From Richard de Arms to John Andrews, at supplication of Richard. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1378, p. 146, 1389. Page 95. From John Roos to Roger Lestrange, granted by the former. Footnote, Pat. Roll 1378, pages 112.113. From Peter de Sanito Paulo to John de Illerling, made by the former and confirmed by the king. Footnote, Cal Pat. Roll 1350, page 574. Doubtless many other examples could be found, since I have not attempted to do more than note the cases that fell under my eye. Apparently the sale of annuities was quite as ordinary and recognized a practice as that of offices or lands. Footnote, John Scalby, to whom Chaucer's annuity was granted, seems to have been an esquire in the king's household. The first record of him is a grant for life to John de Scalby of the forestership and custody of the forest of Parkhurst and Ode Park, Isle of Wight, 1382. In 1386 John de Scalby the elder was on a commission in East Riding, Yorkshire. In 12 Richard II John Scalby, esquire of the Bishop of Sarum, borrowed 20 shillings from the Exchequer. In 17 Richard II he and his wife Matilda borrowed L26 13ths. 4d, i.e. the 40 marks of his annuity, from the Exchequer. In 1396 the king granted to his esquires Richard Cartemere and John de Scalby the goods and chattels of a certain outlaw, to the value of £37. In 22 Richard H. John Scalby, Souterfer, was sent from Lichfield to Conway on secret business of the king, and was paid 16 shillings 8 pence for his expenses. In 1399 Henry IV confirmed the grant of 40 marks a year to John Scalby. Cal Pat. Roll 1382, page 150, Edom page 261, Issues, page 319, mem. 18, Edom, page 332, mem. 23, Cal Pat. Roll 1396, p. 48, Issues, page 344, mem. 11, Cal Pat. Roll 1399, page 62. That Chaucer was out of favor from 1391 on, and in financial trouble, is again difficult to establish. Mr. Kirk has shown that his borrowings at the Exchequer in those years were for the most part no borrowings at all, but simply a device for getting money that was due him. Footnote L. R. Pages XLV 46. Furthermore, many examples of the drawing of money, de prestito, from the Exchequer may be found in the issue roll. In 11 Richard II Philippa Duchess of Ireland drew L 133, yes. 8d, in this way. Footnote, Issues, page 316, mem. 18. In the same year Bmond Rose borrowed money from the Exchequer. Footnote, idem. As shown above, John Scalby twice drew money in advance in this way. John Hurling, who in Chaucer's time was Usher of the Chamber, borrowed £7 4d in 28 Edward III, repaying it later. Footnote, Edom, page 294, mem. 18. And in 29 Edward III drew £40 in the same way. Footnote: Issues, page 212, MEM. 1. On Hurling's financial position, see page 27 above. So hosts of examples could be collected from the issue roll of such borrowings. Certainly they do not indicate that the borrowers were financially insolvent. Moreover, none of the other facts which we have warrants us in assuming that Chaucer was pressed for money and out of favor. In January 1393 he was granted £10 for good service rendered in this year now present, i.e. apparently the later part of 1392, the year following his dismissal. In addition, he was in 1394 granted another annuity of £20. In view of these facts, it would seem that the only definite evidence of Chaucer's poverty was the action for debt of L14. 1s, 11d. In 1398, but the circumstances connected with it, the king's letters of protection and the sheriff's inability to find Chaucer, are so remarkable that we cannot draw certain inferences from it. Footnote: see Kirk L. R. page 47f. Looking at all the facts, then, we must admit that they do not form any proper basis for most of the assertions that have been made. They do not constitute even the suggestion of proof that, when Chaucer lost his controllerships and gave up his annuity, he was out of favor with the king, that he was soon in dire financial straits, and that when again in 1391 he lost the clerkship of the works, he was out of favor and pressed for money. If we wish to guess at the reasons why Chaucer gave up his offices and his pension, we can find plenty of sufficient motives. He may have left the offices for several reasons. He had held the controllership of the customs of wool for 12 years, a long time for the holding of such an office in those days. He may therefore have left because he was tired of them. He may have left them because someone had given him something better. We know, for example, that in the year after he left the clerkship of the works he was employed in some way by the king. So in the earlier case he may have received some other office or employment, the record of which has not come down to us. From November 1386 until November 1387 we know that Richard II was scouring the Midlands trying to gather a force with which to oppose Gloucester. He may have employed Chaucer as a secret messenger throughout that year. As to the annuity, Chaucer may have surrendered it because he could get a good price for it, and wanted a large sum of money for some purpose, perhaps to buy land or improve it. Or his surrender of the annuity may have been made by arrangement with the king, who may have wished to give an annuity to a comparatively new esquire, and who may have recompensed Chaucer in some other way. Every fact that we have would fit into the theory that Chaucer led a prosperous and important life, in a business and financial way, from 1374 to the end of his life. Certainly he must have received a large amount of money in that time. We have no evidence of his having lost any. We know of nothing in his character which would lead us to suppose him a spendthrift or inefficient in financial affairs. I do not wish to maintain that he was always prosperous, but only that the facts do not warrant us in assuming that he was constantly on the verge of ruin in the years when, so far as we know, he held no office. In connection with the Piers-Plowman controversy, I have been struck with Mr. Jusserand's insistence that Chaucer did not touch upon social or political matters in his poems. That was, as Mr. Manley has indicated, very probably due to a theory of the proper subject matter of poetry, an idea current in his time and enunciated by Alan Clydear most distinctly. But back of that may have been in Chaucer's case certain peculiar traits of character. Chaucer was in direct connection with the court and with the city at the time when political enmity between two main factions was very bitter, so bitter that in 1386 it led to the killing of Simon de Burley and Sir Nicholas Brember, as well as less-known men like Beauchamp and Salisbury and Berners, and to the flight of men like Michael de la Pole and Robert de Vere. And again in 1392 led to the execution of the Earl of Arundel, the murder of Gloucester, and almost to the murder of the Earl of Warwick. Chaucer was in daily contact with men connected with one faction or the other. What was his attitude? What party did he follow? I have tried to suppose that he was a member of the Gloucester or Lancaster faction, but I have found facts such as his retention by Richard as controller of the customs from 1383 to 4 on, and his subsequent appointment to the clerkship of the works, that could scarcely have been brought about by Lancastrian influence. Then I have tried to use as a hypothesis the conception that he was a partisan of the king. But I have not been able to reconcile with that idea the fact that he had the grant of the annuity from John of Gaunt, that Henry IV in the year of his accession granted him an extra annuity of 40 marks in addition to the L20 which he confirmed to him, and that in 1395 or 1396 he seems to have been in the employment of either John of Gaunt or Henry, his son. Consequently, it seems to me that Chaucer cannot have been active in politics. At the very time when factional strife was waging about him, he must have kept practically free from both parties. He seems to have had friends in both camps, though by far the greater number were in that of the king. Otto de Grauncin, a member of John of Gaunt's household and in later years apparently Henry of Derby, represent the Lancastrian side. On the other hand, Lewis Clifford, John Clanvow, John Burleigh, men apparently attached to the Black Prince, his wife and his son, Brember and Philipot, with whom he must have been on fairly good terms, and probably even Thomas Usk, were men strongly opposed to John of Gaunt. Too many things connect Chaucer with both parties to make his identification with either possible. The reasons why Chaucer did not dabble pronouncedly in politics may have been various: a clear perception that such was the only safe course for him, an entire indifference and lack of understanding of politics, or what you will. At any rate, his connection with both parties is certainly in consonance with the exclusion from his poetry of political matter of the kind which appears, for example, in Chaucer. Index of names: Almania, Henricus, Almain, Archibald, William, Archer, Agnes, Archer, Roger, Alexandra de la Motte, wife of Arms, Richard de C. Careswell, Richard de Barber, Reynold, Le Bardolph, Robert Belknap, Robert Beauchamp, John, Joan, wife of Beauchamp, Sir William de Berkeley, Sir Edward de Burns, John de Beverley, John de Anisha, wife of Blackamoor, William Bokenham, Simon de C. Buchanum, Matilda Durand, wife of Bonington, Roger Brember, Nicholas Branchesley, William Brokehill, Thomas Buchanum, Simon Buckton, Burrell, William de Burleigh, Berg, Simon Burleigh, Sir John de Burleigh, Simon de Biker, Patrick, John, William, Cambridge, C. Edmund, Count of Careswell, Richard Carrade, Nicholas, the elder, the younger, Cat, John, Chamber, Griffith de la Cheyne, Hugh, Joan, wife of Roger, Thomas, John, William, Chippenham, Walter, Clanvow, Sir John, or Clanbrow, Clarence, C. Lionel, Countess of C. Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster, Clevery, Roger, Clifford, Louis de Clinton, John Clopton, Walter Clopton, William Cobham, John de Coningsby, John de Corby, Robert de Alice, wife of Cornwall, Piers de Culpeper, Thomas d'Abrichecourt, Collard, or Nicholas, Elizabeth, wife of Devereux, John Edward, the Black Prince, Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster Felbrigg, George Margaret, wife of Anne, wife of Ferrers, Robert de Elizabeth, wife of Ferrer, Roger C. Bonington, Roger Fogg, Thomas Forrester, Richard Foxall, Thomas Fremingham, John Frowick, Thomas Gambin, William Gertler, Robert Geysers, Henry Goderic, John Gosdine, John Grounson, Odo de Hannemere, David Hawberk, Lawrence Hawtine, Thomas Hurling, John de Hermes Thorpe, John Hertfordingbury, Thomas Erland, Richard Isabella, wife of Ingelram de Courcy Jos, John of Gaunt Knivton, Ralph de Lancaster, C. John of Gaunt Larderer, Robert C. Magfeld, Robert Leche, Richard C. Erland, Richard Leggett, Helming Edmund, Count of Cambridge Alice, wife of Legge, John Urchedinkin, Rollin Agnes, wife of Lionel, Duke of Clarence Loth, Robert Joan, wife of Loveden, Thomas Lingen, Hugh Agatha, wife of Magfeld, Robert Mareschal, Roger Markham, Richard Nerret, Hannon Newport, Reginald Northberry, Richard Northrilg, John Olney, John Stefanetta, wife of Organ, John Padbury, John Peckham, James de Percy, Thomas de Philipot, John Pole, Michael de la Priage, Nicholas Preston, Piers Alice, wife of Richard Turick Hill, William Rissaby, William de Romsey, John de Margaret, wife of Romulo, Stephen Roos, John Rose, Esmond Agnes Archer, wife of Salisbury, John de Johanna, wife of Scalby, John Scogan, Henry Souch, Robert Law Caesarsh Spiggernell, Thomas, Catherine, wife of Staines, Thomas de Strelly, Hugh Strahl Street, William, Joan wife of Stuckle, Geoffrey, Styuical, Talbot, Gilbert Tetsworth, Edmund de Thorpe, Johann de Titchemarsh, Johann, C. Tiskamarsh Mabel, wife of Tippet, John, Topcliffe, William, Torpearl, Richard, Margaret, wife of Tressahan, Robert, Tyhamarsh, John de C. Titchemarsh Tyndall, Andrew, Urswick, Robert, Usk, Thomas, Vere, Robert de Viner, Robert, Waffer, Richard, C. Markham, Richard Wake, Hugh, Joan wife of Walsh, Water, Walworth, Ward, John, Bifroes, Walter Wyght, Walter Yardley, Adam, Ibernia, Cornelius de York, William Zush, Robert La C. Souch. End of Project Gutenberg's Chaucer's Official Life, by James Root Hulbert.